Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. We had arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, the sun still high in the sky as we set up our tents and unpacked our supplies. I remember being so excited to sleep under the stars, roast marshmallows, and tell spooky stories around the campfire. Little did I know, the scariest story of all was about to unfold right before my eyes. As night fell, we gathered around the flickering flames, my dad grilling up some chicken for dinner while my mom laid out paper plates and plastic utensils. The aroma of barbecue filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. We laughed and joked as we ate, completely unaware of the watchful eyes lurking just beyond the tree line. After dinner, we cleaned up and stored the leftover chicken in a large bucket with a lid, placing it on the picnic table near our tents. My parents always emphasized the importance of proper food storage to avoid attracting wildlife. If only we had known what was really out there in those woods. As we settled into our sleeping bags for the night, the forest came alive with a cacophony of chirping crickets and hooting owls. I drifted off to sleep, feeling safe and content, nestled between my parents in our family-sized tent. But sometime in the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by a series of loud metallic clangs. My eyes flew open, heart racing as I tried to make sense of the unfamiliar sounds. Through the thin fabric of the tent, I could see the dim glow of our solar-powered lantern illuminating a massive, hulking shape just outside. Whatever it was big, way bigger than any animal I'd ever seen before. I wanted to cry out, to wake my parents, but fear paralyzed me. I lay there, frozen, as I watched the dark silhouette move around our campsite. The clanging continued, accompanied by wet, smacking sounds. It took me a moment to realize what was happening. The creature was eating our leftover chicken straight out of the bucket. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out more details of the beast. It was covered in thick, matted fur, standing on two legs like a person, but impossibly tall and broad. Its arms were long and powerful, ending in what looked like massive hands with sharp claws. The creature moved with an eerie mix of animal-like grace and almost human dexterity as it devoured our food. I must have made some small sound of terror because suddenly the beast's head snapped in my direction. Two glowing eyes reflected the lantern light, boring straight into mine. In that moment, I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This was no ordinary animal. There was an uncanny intelligence behind those eyes that chilled me to my core. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature lumbered off into the darkness, taking the chicken bucket with it. I lay there shaking, too afraid to move or make a sound, until exhaustion finally pulled me back into a fitful sleep. When morning came, I tried to tell my family what I'd seen, but they dismissed it as a bad dream. The missing chicken was blamed on raccoons, or maybe a bear, despite the lack of other evidence. But I knew what I had witnessed was something far stranger and more terrifying than any normal forest creature. As the day went on, I tried to push the memories of the night before out of my mind. My sister suggested we go exploring the nearby trails, and I eagerly agreed, desperate for a distraction. We set off hand in hand, our parents calling after us to stay close to the campsite. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy and wildflowers dotting the undergrowth. For a while, I almost forgot about the terrifying encounter from the night before. But as we ventured further from camp, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. The birds had gone quiet, and there was a heaviness to the air that hadn't been there before. I tugged on my sister's hand, suggesting we turn back, but she insisted on pressing on. That's when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My sister panicked, shoving me aside as she took off running back towards camp. I stumbled, losing my footing on the uneven ground. As I fell, my head struck a sharp rock jutting out of the earth. Pain exploded behind my eyes as warm blood began to trickle down my face. I lay there dazed, vision blurring as I struggled to stay conscious. Through the haze of pain, I became aware of heavy footsteps approaching. A whimper escaped my lips as a massive fur-covered form loomed over me. This was it, I thought. The monster had come back to finish me off, but to my utter shock, the creature didn't attack. Instead, it gently scooped me up in its enormous arms, cradling me against its broad chest like a baby. The fur was coarse but warm against my skin, and I could hear the steady thump of a heartbeat beneath it. As the beast carried me through the forest, I drifted in and out of consciousness. Part of me was still terrified, but another part felt strangely safe in its powerful embrace. Before I knew it, we had arrived back at our campsite. I heard my mother's scream of horror as the creature set me down carefully on the ground. By the time my parents reached me, the beast had vanished back into the trees. They fussed over my injury, peppering me with questions about what had happened. In my confused, concussed state, all I could manage to say was that a big, furry bear had carried me home. We cut our camping trip short after that, rushing to the nearest hospital to have my head wound treated. The doctors said I was lucky. The gash wasn't as bad as it looked, and I didn't have a serious concussion. But the real wound went far deeper than any physical injury. For years afterward, I struggled to make sense of what had transpired that day at Soul Creek Falls. I had nightmares about glowing eyes in the darkness and massive fur-covered creatures lurking just out of sight. My parents wrote it off as an overactive imagination combined with the trauma of my accident. Even I began to doubt my own memories as time passed. But as I got older and learned more about cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena, I started to piece things together. The creature I encountered that night wasn't a bear or any other known animal. Its size, its behavior, the way it moved on two legs, it all pointed to one incredible conclusion. I had come face to face with Bigfoot, not just once, but twice in the span of 24 hours. The same creature that had terrified me by raiding our campsite had also saved my life when I was injured and alone in the woods. It was a realization that shook me to my core and forever changed how I viewed the world around me. To this day, I've never told anyone the full story of what happened at Soul Creek Falls. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, what I experienced. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edges of our understanding. And sometimes they're not as monstrous as we might think. I often find myself wondering about that Bigfoot. Was it simply curious about us humans? Did it feel remorse for scaring me and decide to help when it saw I was hurt? Or was there some deeper connection, some spark of empathy between two intelligent species? I'll probably never know the answers to those questions. But one thing's for certain, I'll never look at the forests of Oregon the same way again. Every time I hear an unexplained sound in the woods or catch a glimpse of movement just out of the corner of my eye, I wonder, is it watching me even now? That gentle giant with eyes that reflect both animal wildness and something unnervingly close to human intelligence. The experience left me with a profound sense of both wonder and unease about the natural world. There are mysteries out there waiting to be unraveled, creatures yet to be discovered, and sometimes the line between friend and foe, between monster and protector, is blurrier than we'd like to admit. I've returned to Soul Creek Falls a few times over the years, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature that both terrified and saved me. But the woods have remained stubbornly silent, offering up no new clues or encounters. Perhaps that's for the best. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, leaving us to ponder the vast unknown that still exists in the world around us. All I know for certain is that on one fateful night in the forests of Lane County, Oregon, I came face to face with something extraordinary. And whether you choose to believe my story or not, I'll carry the memories of that encounter with me for the rest of my life. A reminder that there's always more to the world than meets the eye, if only we're brave enough to look for it. Story 2. I'll never forget that Labor Day weekend in 2008. My husband Jesse and I had decided to take the kids out to Lane County, Oregon for some blackberry picking. It was supposed to be a fun family outing, but it turned into something I still can't explain to this day. We'd found this perfect little spot by a river, absolutely bursting with ripe berries. The weather was gorgeous, one of those crisp, clear September days that make you glad to be alive. Jesse had taken our son into town to grab some extra buckets, leaving me and our daughter Emily to get started on the picking. Emily was having a blast, eagerly filling her bucket and occasionally sneaking berries into her mouth when she thought I wasn't looking. I was lost in my own world, enjoying the peaceful sounds of nature and the repetitive motions of plucking berries. After a while, Emily got bored with picking and started exploring the area. She found a big fallen branch and began dragging it around, pretending it was a sword or something. I kept an eye on her but wasn't too worried. We were the only ones around for miles. Suddenly, I heard a loud thwack as Emily whacked the branch against a nearby tree trunk. The sound echoed across the quiet landscape. I was about to tell her to be more careful when I heard it. A blood-curdling scream from the other side of the river. It wasn't human, I can tell you that much. It was this guttural, animalistic howl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Emily dropped her stick and ran to me, clinging to my leg. "Mommy, what was that?" she whispered, eyes wide with fear. I don't know, sweetie," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. It was probably just an animal. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. No animal I'd ever heard could make a sound like that. We stood frozen for a few moments, straining our ears. The forest had gone eerily silent, no birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush. It was like everything was holding its breath. Then it started. At first I thought I was imagining things. A faint splashing sound coming from the river. I peered through the trees, trying to get a better view of the water. What I saw made my blood run cold. Rocks. Softball-sized rocks were falling into the middle of the river, one after another, plop, 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 creating perfect concentric circles in the calm water. But here's the thing. There was nobody there throwing them. The opposite bank was completely empty as far as I could see. "Emily, stay behind me," I said, pushing her back as I took a few tentative steps closer to the river's edge. The rocks kept coming, splashing down in an unnervingly regular rhythm. I scanned the tree line on the other side, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe there was someone hidden in the trees throwing the rocks. But as I looked at the steep, densely forested incline on the other side, I realized that was impossible. There was no way a person could stand on that slope and accurately throw rocks that far without losing their balance and tumbling down the hill. The splashing continued, and I noticed the rocks were getting bigger. What had started as softball-sized stones were now closer to the size of cantaloupes. The sound of them hitting the water was like cannon fire in the silent forest. Emily was crying now, her face buried in my side. I wanted nothing more than to run, to grab her and sprint back to the car. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the inexplicable scene before me. Suddenly, there was a tremendous crack from the other side of the river. A massive tree, easily 5 feet in diameter, began to slowly tilt. With a great groaning of wood and a shower of leaves, it toppled over and crashed into the river, sending up a huge plume of water. That finally broke my paralysis. I scooped Emily up in my arms and ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the thorns that tore at my clothes and skin. Emily was sobbing into my shoulder, and I could hear my own ragged breathing as I sprinted blindly through the woods. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. I finally burst out of the tree line onto the dirt road where we'd parked our car. Jesse's truck was there. They must have just gotten back from town. Jesse jumped out of the driver's seat, a look of alarm on his face. "Vicky, what's wrong? What happened?" I couldn't speak. I just stood there, gasping for air, clutching Emily to my chest. Our son climbed out of the truck, looking confused and scared. "We need to go," I finally managed to choke out. "We need to go right now." Jesse, bless him, didn't ask any more questions. He must have seen the wild look in my eyes. He just nodded, helped me and Emily into the truck, and we tore out of there like bats out of hell. It wasn't until we were miles away, safely back on the main highway, that I finally started to calm down enough to tell Jesse what had happened. Even as the words came out of my mouth, I could hardly believe it myself. It sounded insane, impossible. Jesse listened quietly, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "We should report this," he finally said. "Call the police or the Forest Service or something." But I shook my head. "And tell them what? That we heard a monster scream and saw invisible rock throwers? They'll think we're crazy." In the end, we didn't tell anyone. Who would believe us? I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that day, to come up with some logical explanation. But I can't. To this day, I have no idea what we experienced in those woods. All I know is that I'll never go blackberry picking again. And whenever I hear about Bigfoot sightings or strange occurrences in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, I can't help but shudder. Because I know deep in my bones that there are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation. Things that most people will go their whole lives without encountering. But once you've seen them, you can never unsee them, and you'll never feel quite safe in the woods again. I still have nightmares about that day sometimes. I'll wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of that inhuman scream echoing in my ears. In my dreams, I'm back by that river, watching those rocks fall into the water. But in the dreams, I can see what's throwing them, and I wake up just before it turns its attention to me. I don't know what was out there in those woods. I don't want to know. All I know is that it was real, it was terrifying, and it changed me forever. So if you're ever out in the forests of Oregon and you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, or see something you can't explain, don't stick around to investigate. Run. Run as fast as you can, because some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 3. I was just a young guy back in '88, fresh out of high school and eager to prove myself as a real man. My buddy Jake and I decided to go deer hunting up near Diamond Peak Wilderness in Lane County. We'd been planning this trip for months, saving up for gear and dreaming about bagging our first buck. The drive up was filled with excited chatter about hunting strategies and which trails to take. Jake kept going on about how he was going to get the biggest deer and how I'd be eating his dust. I mostly stayed quiet, taking in the scenery as the trees got taller and the air got crisper. We set up camp in a small clearing not far from one of the main trails. Nothing fancy, just a couple of tents and a fire pit. That first night around the campfire, sipping beers and swapping stories, I felt like I was finally living the rugged outdoorsman life I'd always imagined. The next morning we were up before dawn, eager to get out there and start tracking. We split up to cover more ground, agreeing to meet back at camp by sundown. I headed north, following an old logging road that wound its way up into more densely forested areas. For hours I trudged through the underbrush, eyes peeled for any signs of deer. The day was overcast and chilly, with a light drizzle that made everything damp and gloomy. By early afternoon I was starting to get discouraged. I hadn't seen so much as a hoof print, let alone an actual deer. That's when I came across the steep ravine. It was maybe 30 feet deep, with sheer rock walls on either side. I was carefully picking my way along the edge, looking for a safe place to cross, when something caught my eye. At first I thought it was just an odd depression in the mud, but as I got closer, I realized it was a footprint, and not just any footprint. This thing was massive. I crouched down to get a better look, my heart starting to race. The print was only partial, cut off by the edge of the ravine, but what I could see was enough to send chills down my spine. It was easily 19 centimeters wide, way bigger than any human foot, and I could make out the impression of 5 distinct toes, spread wide, as if to grip the muddy ground. But the thing that really got me was how deep it was. The edges were crisp and well-defined, sunk several inches into the soft earth. Whatever made this print had to have been incredibly heavy. I sat there staring at it for I don't know how long, my mind racing. Could this be? No, it couldn't be. That stuff wasn't real. But then, what the hell made this print? Part of me wanted to run back to camp and show Jake, but I knew he'd just laugh it off. Jake was a total skeptic when it came to anything paranormal or unexplained. He'd probably say it was just some weirdly shaped erosion or something, so I kept it to myself. But I couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the day. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made me jump. I kept imagining I saw large, dark shapes moving just at the edge of my vision. By the time I made it back to camp that evening, I was a nervous wreck. Jake immediately noticed something was off and kept pestering me about it. I brushed him off, saying I was just tired from hiking all day. But inside, I was a mess of conflicting emotions: excitement, fear, doubt, curiosity. That night, I barely slept. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified. Was that just the wind, or something large moving through the trees? Were those really just coyotes howling in the distance, or something else entirely? The rest of the trip was a bust as far as hunting went. I was too distracted to focus, constantly scanning the tree line and jumping at shadows. Jake got increasingly annoyed with my jumpiness, accusing me of being a city boy who couldn't handle the woods. On the drive home, I was tempted so many times to tell him what I'd seen, but I knew he'd just mock me for it. So I kept quiet. That image of the massive footprint burned into my mind. For years afterwards, I'd lie awake at night thinking about it. I'd scour the internet for similar reports, read every book I could find on the subject. But I never went back to that spot. Part of me was afraid of what I might, or might not, find. It wasn't until years later that I started hearing rumors from other hunters in the area. Stories of strange howls echoing through the hills at night, of massive, hair-covered figures glimpsed between the trees. It sent shivers down my spine every time. To this day, I'm not sure what to believe. Maybe it was just some freak natural formation that happened to look like a footprint. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after hours alone in the woods. But deep down, I know what I saw. And sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can hear something calling from those distant hills. Something ancient, something powerful, something that doesn't want to be found. I've never told anyone this story before now. Even after all these years, I can feel my palms get sweaty and my heart rate pick up just thinking about it. That day changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. Sometimes I think about going back, trying to find that ravine again. But then I remember the sheer size of that print, the impossible depth of it. and I realized that maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because if that print was real, if there really is something out there in those woods, then everything I thought I knew about the world is wrong. And that's a reality I'm not sure I'm ready to face. So I keep this secret, carry it with me like a weight. And every time I hear about another strange sighting or unexplained sound from those mountains, I wonder, did someone else stumble across what I found that day? And if they did, were they brave enough or foolish enough to follow where it led? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know this. Those woods hold secrets, dark, ancient secrets that maybe we're not meant to understand. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and still, I swear I can hear something calling me back there, back to that ravine, back to that impossible footprint. And God help me, part of me wants to answer that call, to finally unravel the mystery that's haunted me for all these years. But the rest of me, the part that still remembers the primal fear I felt that day, that part knows better. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And some truths are better left buried in the dark places of the world. So I stay here, caught between fear and fascination, forever changed by what I saw that day in the wilderness. And I wonder, how many others are out there carrying similar secrets? How many of us have brushed up against something beyond our understanding, only to retreat back into the comfort of the familiar? I may never know, but I do know this. Those woods are alive with more than just deer and bears. There's something else out there, something ancient and powerful, and sometimes, in my darkest moments, I fear it knows I've seen its tracks, that someday, somehow, it might come looking for me. But for now, I keep my secret, and I wait, caught between the world I thought I knew and the impossible reality I glimpsed that day in the forest. Forever changed, forever wondering, what if? Story 4. As I strolled along the familiar path through the woods behind my house, I had an eerie feeling that something wasn't quite right. The forest seemed unusually quiet, no birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, I heard heavy breathing coming from the trees to my left. At first, I thought it might be a deer or even a bear, but when I turned to look, my blood ran cold. There, partially obscured by the mist and foliage, was a massive grey figure. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but far too large to be human. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature was easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, but unlike the muscular, ape-like beast I'd always imagined Bigfoot to be, this thing was oddly lean and lanky. Its limbs seemed almost too long for its body, giving it an unsettling, alien appearance. For a few heart-stopping seconds, it just stood there, staring at me with dark, glinting eyes. I could hear its labored breathing, deep, raspy inhales that sent chills down my spine. It was only about 50-70 feet away from me, close enough that I could make out matted grey fur covering its body. I stood frozen in terror, afraid to move or even blink. The creature took a few slow, lumbering steps, its gait awkward and unnatural. Twigs snapped under its massive feet as it moved. In that moment, I was absolutely certain I was looking at a Sasquatch, the legendary Bigfoot I'd heard stories about my whole life, but never truly believed in until now. Just as quickly as it appeared, the creature turned and melted back into the misty forest. The entire encounter probably only lasted 5 to 7 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. As soon as it was gone, I turned and ran back to my house as fast as my legs would carry me, my heart pounding in my chest. Once safely inside, I tried to calm myself down and make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Had I really seen what I thought I saw, or was my mind playing tricks on me? But I knew deep down that it had been real. The image of that towering grey figure was burned into my memory. After a few hours, I worked up the courage to venture back out to the spot where I'd had the encounter. I half expected, and honestly hoped, to find nothing, some proof that I'd imagined the whole thing. But what I discovered only confirmed my fears. There, in the soft dirt of the forest floor, were a series of massive footprints. They were easily 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. The stride length between them was enormous, much longer than any human could make. My hands shook as I knelt down to examine them more closely. I took some photos with my phone, though they didn't do justice to the scale and detail of the prints. I considered calling the police or forest service, but what would I even say? I knew how crazy it would sound. Who would believe me? In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what I'd seen. I couldn't sleep, plagued by nightmares of that creature lurking just outside my window. Every sound in the night made me jump. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that grey figure looming behind me. I started researching Bigfoot sightings online and was shocked to discover how many reports there were from the Linn County area. Some of the descriptions matched almost exactly what I'd seen, a tall, grey, surprisingly thin creature. It both comforted and terrified me to know I wasn't alone in my experience. I debated for a long time whether to share my story. I knew people would think I was crazy or lying, but I also felt a responsibility to let others know what was out there. That's why I'm finally writing this now, hoping that someone out there will believe me. Since that day, I've had a few other strange experiences that make me think the creature is still out there. I've heard unusual howls and knocks in the woods at night. Once, I found a half-eaten deer carcass near my property line, torn apart in a way no normal predator could have done. Just last month, my neighbor told me he saw something huge and grey moving through his backyard in the middle of the night. He didn't get a good look at it, but his description gave me chills. It was eerily similar to what I'd seen. I don't go into those woods alone anymore. The memory of that encounter is still too vivid, too terrifying. But I can't bring myself to move away either. This is my home, and I refuse to be driven out by fear. Still, I'm always on alert now, always watching the tree line. Sometimes on quiet nights, I swear I can hear that heavy breathing again, carried on the wind. And I know deep in my bones that it's out there somewhere, watching and waiting. The Sasquatch of Linn County isn't just a legend or a campfire story. It's real, and it's closer than any of us want to believe. I don't know why it showed itself to me that day. Was it just chance, or was there some greater purpose? I may never know the answer. But I do know that my life has been forever changed by those few seconds in the misty Oregon woods. I've seen something that shouldn't exist, something that challenges everything we think we know about the natural world. To anyone reading this who might be skeptical, I understand. I was a skeptic too once. But I'm telling you with absolute certainty that these creatures are out there. If you find yourself in the forests of Linn County, stay alert. Listen for that heavy breathing. Watch for movement in the trees. And if you're lucky, or unlucky, enough to have your own encounter, know that you're not alone. I often wonder if I'll ever see it again. Part of me hopes I do, if only to prove to myself once and for all that I'm not crazy. But a bigger part of me prays that I never come face to face with that creature again. The memory of those dark, intelligent eyes staring into mine is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, I know how it sounds. But I swear on everything I hold dear that every word is true. The Sasquatch is real, and it's here in Linn County. Stay safe out there and keep watching the woods. You never know what might be watching back. Story 5. As we settled in for the night, the air was crisp and still. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the lake water and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was so peaceful that I drifted off to sleep almost immediately. I'm not sure exactly what time it was when I woke up, but it was still pitch black outside. At first I thought maybe I had just been startled awake by a dream. But then I heard it. Heavy footsteps coming from the direction of the lake. They were slow and deliberate, and with each step I could feel a slight tremor in the ground. My heart started racing. I reached over to wake my girlfriend, but she was already awake too. We lay there frozen, barely daring to breathe as we listened to whatever it was getting closer and closer to our tent. The footsteps were strange. It would take a few heavy steps, then a couple lighter ones, almost like it was limping or had an odd gait. As it got nearer, I could hear deep, raspy breathing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It came right up to our tent, so close that I swear I could feel its presence just on the other side of the thin fabric. We didn't move a muscle. I was terrified it would hear us or smell us. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, it moved away from our tent. I heard it shuffling around our campsite, knocking things over. Then there was a clatter of metal. It was messing with our cooking gear we had left out by the fire pit. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I remembered there was another group camping nearby, some college kids who had set up about a quarter-mile down the shore. To my horror, I realized the creature was now heading in their direction. We lay there paralyzed with fear, straining our ears to listen. For a few minutes, all was quiet. Then suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It was clearly a young woman's voice. My blood ran cold. The scream was cut short, and then we heard several male voices yelling and another scream. There were crashes and thuds, like a struggle was happening. And then, silence. We didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, we cautiously unzipped the tent and peered out. Our campsite was a mess, pots and pans strewn about, our cooler tipped over. But nothing was missing. We debated what to do. Part of me wanted to just pack up and get the hell out of there. But we felt like we had to check on the other campers to make sure they were okay. So we slowly made our way down the shore to where their site had been. What we found chilled me to the bone. Their tents were still there, but they were shredded to pieces. Sleeping bags and backpacks were scattered everywhere. There was no sign of the campers themselves. As we looked around in shock, I noticed large, bare footprints in the mud near the water's edge. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, and the stride length between them was massive, much longer than any human could make. We got out of there as fast as we could and called the police. They came out and searched the area but found no trace of the missing campers. They seemed skeptical of our story about the creature in the night. To this day, I don't know exactly what happened out there. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head. Was it some kind of animal attack, a deranged person, or something else? All I know is that the sound of those heavy footsteps and that girl's scream will haunt me for the rest of my life. I used to love camping and being out in nature, but now I can't shake the feeling that there are things out there in the wilderness that we don't understand. Things that maybe we're not meant to encounter. Sometimes at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like I can hear those footsteps approaching again. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go camping again. The peace and beauty of nature has been forever tainted for me by the terror of that night. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a bear or something. But deep down, I know that's not true. Whatever was out there that night was something far stranger and more terrifying than any normal animal. I've done some research since then, and apparently there have been other strange sightings and encounters in that area of Oregon over the years. Stories of giant ape-like creatures glimpsed in the forest, unusual tracks found, campers and hikers going missing without a trace. Could it have been what some people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch? I used to scoff at those stories, but now I'm not so sure. All I know is that there was something out there that night that defied explanation, something that struck terror into my very soul. I still have nightmares about what might have happened if it had decided to attack us instead of the other campers. Why did it pass us by? Was it just random chance? Or did it somehow sense that there were more people at the other site? And what exactly happened to those poor college kids? Did the creature drag them off into the forest? Are they still out there somewhere? Or did something even worse happen to them? The not knowing is almost worse than anything else. My mind conjures up all sorts of horrible scenarios. I feel guilty that we didn't do more to help them. But realistically, what could we have done against something powerful enough to tear apart tents and carry off multiple people? I've tried to put it behind me and move on with my life. But the truth is, I don't think I'll ever fully recover from what happened that night. It fundamentally changed how I view the world and shattered my sense of safety. I'm sharing this story now as a warning to others. Be careful out there in the wilderness. There are things that lurk in the shadows that we can't begin to comprehend. Things that challenge everything we think we know about the natural world. If you're camping in remote areas, always be aware of your surroundings. Make noise to announce your presence. Travel in groups when possible. And if you hear or see anything unusual, don't investigate. Get out of there as fast as you can. I only wish I had known then what I know now. Maybe I could have done something differently. Maybe those campers would still be alive. But all I can do now is try to prevent others from experiencing the same terror and loss. So please, be safe out there. And if you ever find yourself camping near Lake Wattam on a quiet night, and you hear heavy footsteps approaching in the darkness, don't wait around to see what it is. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Your life may depend on it. Story 6. I'm an avid hiker, and I've explored most of the trails around 6 rivers over the years. There's one area I'd always avoided, though, the old Thompson flat site deep in the woods. Something about those legends always made me uneasy about venturing out there alone. But after a friend dared me to check it out, my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to make the trek. It was a crisp fall morning when I set out, the kind of day that's perfect for a long hike. The trail started off easy enough, winding through familiar forest terrain. But as I got deeper into the woods, things started to feel different. The trees seemed to grow denser and more gnarled. An eerie quiet settled over everything. No birds chirping, no rustling of small animals. Just a heavy stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. After a few hours of hiking, I came to a small clearing. My heart started racing when I saw the crumbling remains of old wooden structures. This had to be Thompson Flat. Rotting boards and rusted metal were scattered about, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. I felt a chill run through me as I imagined the miners who had lived and worked here over a century ago, before whatever happened that drove them all away. I started poking around the ruins, snapping some pictures on my phone. It was fascinating to see these remnants of the past out here in the middle of nowhere. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the trees, but there was never anything there. As the afternoon wore on, I decided I should start heading back before it got dark. That's when things got weird. I could have sworn I heard the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush nearby. I called out, thinking maybe another hiker had wandered into the area, but there was no response. Just more of that unnatural silence. I quickened my pace, wanting to get out of there. The footsteps seemed to be following me, getting closer. My heart was pounding in my chest. I broke into a run, crashing through the bushes. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted down the overgrown trail. Suddenly, I burst into a small clearing and skidded to a stop. There, not 20 feet in front of me, was something. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark, matted fur. For a split second, we just stared at each other. I'll never forget those eyes, deep-set and intelligent, but definitely not human. They bored into me with an intensity I can't describe. I was frozen in terror, unable to move or even breathe. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl that I could feel vibrating in my chest. That snapped me out of my stupor, and I bolted, running faster than I've ever run in my life. I could hear it crashing through the woods behind me, but I didn't dare look back. Somehow I made it back to my car. I peeled out of there, tires squealing on the gravel. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally allowed myself to slow down and breathe. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I've been trying to rationalize what happened ever since. Maybe it was a bear, but I've seen plenty of bears while hiking, and this was different, bigger, more upright. And those eyes, there was an intelligence there that still haunts me. I haven't told anyone else about this. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw out there. And I finally understand why those miners abandoned Thompson Flat all those years ago. There's something in those woods, something that doesn't want humans around. I don't know if it's the same creature from the old legends or what, but I do know that I'm never setting foot in that part of the forest again. It's been a week now, and I still have trouble sleeping. Every little noise outside makes me jump. I keep replaying that moment in the clearing over and over, seeing those eyes staring into me. Sometimes I think I hear that low growl again, even though I'm miles away from Thompson Flat. I've done some research since then, trying to find any other reports of strange sightings in the area. There are a few vague stories here and there, but nothing concrete. It's like people are afraid to talk about it. I did find one old newspaper clipping about that miner who was killed. Apparently his skull was completely crushed. The article said it would have taken incredible strength to do that kind of damage. Part of me wants to go back out there with a camera to try and get proof of what I saw. But every time I think about those woods, that clearing, that thing, I break out in a cold sweat. The rational part of my brain keeps trying to come up with explanations. But deep down, I know the truth. There's something out there in those woods that science can't explain. Something that's been there for a long time and will probably be there long after we're gone. I don't know why it let me go that day. Maybe I just got lucky. But I can't shake the feeling that it was sending me a message, a warning to stay away. And believe me, I intend to heed that warning. Some places are better left alone. Some mysteries better left unsolved. Thompson Flat is one of them. I'm writing this all down partly to try and process what happened, but also as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to go poking around out there. Those old legends exist for a reason. There are things in this world that we don't understand, things that don't want to be understood. If you value your life and your sanity, stay far away from Thompson Flat. Sometimes at night, when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can hear that growl again, carried on the breeze from miles away. It makes me wonder, is it still out there, watching and waiting? And what would happen if it ever decided to leave its forest home and venture into town? I pray we never have to find out. I know this all sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story a few weeks ago, I would have laughed it off. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. That creature was real, and it's still out there. So consider this a warning from someone who learned the hard way. Some legends are better left as just that. Some places should remain unexplored. And if you ever find yourself near Thompson Flat, turn around and don't look back. You might not be as lucky as I was if you come face to face with what's lurking in those woods. Story 7. I was out fishing with my buddies on the Tualatin River near Portland last weekend. Just a normal day off from our construction jobs, trying to relax and catch some fish. We'd found a nice quiet spot downstream from the main recreation areas. The trees were thick along the banks, giving us some shade from the summer sun. We'd been there for a couple hours, not having much luck, when I noticed some movement in the trees across the river. At first I thought it was just a deer or something, but then I saw this massive dark shape emerge from the foliage. My heart nearly stopped. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, and covered in thick reddish-brown hair. I froze, not believing my eyes. Was I really seeing what I thought I was seeing? The creature moved with surprising grace for its size, stepping out into the shallow water at the river's edge. That's when I noticed there was a second, slightly smaller one right behind it. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I had to get a picture of this, or no one would ever believe me. The creatures seemed oblivious to our presence across the river. They were focused on the water, moving slowly and deliberately. I managed to snap a few photos before my friend Jose hissed at me to put the phone away. "Don't draw attention, pendejo," he whispered urgently. We all sat there in stunned silence, barely daring to breathe as we watched these impossible beings. The larger one, easily 7 feet tall, reached down into the water with startling speed and came up with a large fish thrashing in its massive hand. It bit into the fish, tearing off a chunk of flesh. The sight made my stomach turn. This wasn't some guy in a costume. The powerful muscles rippled under the hair as it moved. And the face, God, the face. It was disturbingly human-like, with a heavy brow and a wide, flat nose. But the eyes, there was an intelligence there that sent chills down my spine. The smaller one, probably around 6'6" or so, bent down to drink from the river. I could see its facial features clearly as it lowered its head, high cheekbones, deep-set eyes, a strong jaw. It was similar to the larger one, but distinct, like they were two different individuals of the same species. I kept snapping photos as discreetly as I could, my hands trembling. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from there as possible, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from this incredible sight. They stayed there for maybe 15 minutes, fishing and drinking. At one point, the larger one made a low grunting sound and gestured upstream. The smaller one nodded, actually nodded, in response. The level of communication and obvious intelligence was astonishing. Just as suddenly as they had appeared, they melted back into the dense forest, vanishing from sight. We sat there in shocked silence for several minutes after they'd gone. Did that really just happen?" my friend Miguel finally whispered. I nodded mutely, still struggling to process what we'd seen. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands to look at the photos, praying I'd actually managed to capture something. To my relief, there they were, several clear shots of the two creatures. You could make out the muscular bodies, the hair, even some of the facial features. There was no denying what we'd seen. "We have to tell someone about this," Jose said. "Call the news or something." But Miguel shook his head vehemently. "No way, man, we can't. You know they'll never believe us. They'll say it's fake, or we're crazy, or on drugs or something. And you know how it is for us. We don't need that kind of attention." He had a point. As Mexican immigrants, we tried to keep a low profile. The last thing we needed was to become some media circus freak show, or worse, get accused of perpetrating a hoax. "So what? We just pretend this didn't happen?" I asked. "For now, yeah," Miguel said. "Let's just keep this between us until we figure out what to do." We packed up our gear in silence and headed back to town. I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. Those creatures. There was no doubt in my mind they were what people called Bigfoot, but seeing them in person, they seemed so much more real and terrifying than any blurry photos or cheesy recreations on TV. That night I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those penetrating, intelligent eyes staring back at me. I kept replaying the encounter over and over, the way they moved, the obvious intelligence and communication between them. It challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. The next morning, I woke up to several missed calls and texts from Jose and Miguel. Apparently word had gotten out somehow about our sighting. There were reporters sniffing around, asking questions. I panicked. This was exactly what we didn't want to happen. I quickly sent the photos to a buddy of mine for safekeeping, then deleted them off my phone. No way was I going to let anyone get a hold of those. Over the next few days, the story spread like wildfire. There were news vans camped out near the river, people combing the woods looking for signs of the creatures. I laid low, not answering my door or phone. But it wasn't just the media attention that had me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. More than once, I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing there. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to strange noises outside my window. Was I just being paranoid? Or had our encounter somehow drawn the attention of these beings? The thought sent icy tendrils of fear through me. About a week after the sighting, I got a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was gruff, authoritative. "We know what you saw," the man said without preamble, "and we know you have photographic evidence. For your own safety, I strongly suggest you forget what you saw and destroy those photos. There are things in this world that the public isn't ready to know about. Do you understand?" Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood there holding the phone, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Who was that? Government? Military? Something else entirely? That was the last straw for me. I packed a bag that night and left town, heading for my cousin's place a few states away. I needed to clear my head, to get away from all of this craziness. It's been a few months now, and I still haven't gone back. I can't bring myself to return to that place, to face what I saw. The photos are safe with my friend, hidden away where no one will find them. Sometimes I wonder if I should release them, let the world see the truth. But then I remember that phone call, the veiled threat, and I know it's safer to keep quiet. I don't know what those creatures were or where they came from. I don't know who's trying to keep their existence a secret, or why. All I know is that my view of reality has been forever changed. There are things out there beyond our understanding, lurking in the shadows of our world. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just catch a glimpse of them. I still have nightmares about those eyes. That intelligence, so familiar, yet so alien. I can't shake the feeling that they're out there, watching, waiting. And I can't help but wonder, what happens when they decide they're done hiding? Story 8. It's been 3 weeks since that day in 6 Rivers, and I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. I keep replaying every moment in my head, trying to make sense of what happened. I've always been skeptical about Bigfoot, but after what I experienced out there in those remote woods, I'm not so sure anymore. I'm a biology professor at Southwestern Oregon Community College in North Bend. For years, I've heard whispers about Bigfoot sightings in the 6 Rivers area, particularly around Thompson Flat. Most of my colleagues dismissed these stories as tall tales or misidentifications. But something about the consistency of the reports intrigued me. When I had some time off between semesters, I decided to do some first-hand investigating. My first stop was the Myrtle Point Tavern, a local watering hole known for its colorful regulars. I struck up a conversation with an old-timer named Earl, who claimed to be a retired gold prospector. When I mentioned I was researching local wildlife, his rheumy eyes lit up. "You ain't here about no deer or bear, are ya?" he chuckled, taking a long swig of beer. "You're after the big guy." I tried to play it cool, but Earl saw right through me. He leaned in close, his breath heavy with alcohol and stale cigarettes. "I seen 'em, you know, more'n once. They're out there in them woods watching, whole family of 'em." Earl went on to describe multiple encounters over his decades of prospecting, massive, hair-covered creatures that moved with surprising stealth through the forest. He told me about finding strange footprints and hearing eerie howls at night. Most chillingly, he recounted how other prospectors had been chased out of the area or even attacked by these beings. "Them creatures don't want us there," Earl said gravely. "That's their territory, and they aim to keep it that way." I pressed him for specifics on locations, and he eventually pointed me towards an especially remote area deep in the Six Rivers National Forest. As I thanked him and got up to leave, Earl grabbed my arm. "Be careful out there, son," he warned. "Them woods got eyes." The next morning, I loaded up my Jeep with camping gear, trail cameras, and scientific equipment. The drive out to Thompson Flat took over 3 hours on increasingly rough roads. By the time I reached the trailhead Earl had described, my cell phone had long since lost service. As I shouldered my heavy pack and started down the overgrown trail, an unsettling silence descended. There were none of the usual forest sounds. No birdsong, no chattering squirrels, nothing. Just the crunch of my boots and my own breathing. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I hiked for several miles, stopping occasionally to set up trail cameras in promising spots. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had me whipping my head around, searching for the source. But I never saw anything concrete, just vague shapes and shadows that vanished when I tried to focus on them. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing next to a burbling creek. It seemed like a good place to set up camp, so I began unpacking my tent. That's when I noticed the footprints in the soft mud by the water's edge. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down to examine them. They were huge, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The shape was generally humanoid, but with a broader ball of the foot and widely spread toes. Whatever made these prints was bipedal and massive. With shaking hands, I took photos and measurements of the tracks. There was a clear trail of them leading upstream. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow them. The prints led me about a quarter-mile up the creek before veering off into a dense stand of old-growth redwoods. As I pushed through the undergrowth, the forest grew darker and more primeval. Tendrils of mist curled around massive tree trunks. An acrid, musky odor filled the air, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation. Suddenly, a blood-curdling howl echoed through the trees. It started low and guttural before rising to a high-pitched shriek that set my hair on end. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. My heart pounding, I spun in a circle, trying to pinpoint the source. That's when I saw it. A massive, dark shape moving through the trees about 50 yards away. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy reddish-brown hair. The way it moved was uncannily fluid for its size, gliding between the trunks with unnatural grace. I fumbled for my camera, but by the time I raised it, the creature had melted back into the shadows. For several long moments I stood rooted to the spot, straining my ears for any sound of movement. The forest had gone deathly quiet again. As the adrenaline faded, I realized how exposed I was. The sunlight was fading fast, and I was deep in unfamiliar territory. I needed to get back to my campsite. I turned to retrace my steps, only to find that I'd lost the trail of footprints. Panic started to set in as I realized I wasn't sure which direction I'd come from. All the trees looked the same in the gathering gloom. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps and branches snapping coming from behind me. Something big was moving through the underbrush, and it was getting closer. I ran. I crashed through the forest, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and snagged my clothes. My lungs burned as I gasped for air. But no matter how fast I ran, I could hear my pursuer gaining ground. The footsteps were right behind me now, accompanied by deep, huffing breaths. Just as I felt a rush of air on the back of my neck, I burst out of the tree line and back into the clearing where I'd set up camp. I risked a glance over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of a huge, hair-covered arm reaching for me. With a final burst of speed, I dove into my tent and zipped it shut. For what felt like hours, I huddled there in terror, listening to the sounds of something massive circling my campsite. Heavy footsteps, snuffling noises, the crack of breaking branches. Several times I felt the tent shake as if something was prodding at it. Eventually the noises faded away, but I remained frozen in place, too scared to even peek outside. I must have dozed off at some point from sheer exhaustion. I awoke at dawn to find my campsite in shambles. My backpack had been torn open, its contents strewn everywhere. Deep gouges marked the trees around the clearing, and there, pressed into a muddy patch of ground, was a single giant footprint, identical to the ones I'd seen by the creek. I didn't even bother trying to salvage my gear. I simply grabbed my camera and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my Jeep hours later. Since that day, I've pored over my photos and notes, trying to make sense of what I experienced. The footprint casts and measurements are compelling physical evidence, but it's the memory of that massive shape moving through the trees, the sound of those thunderous footsteps behind me that I can't shake. I'm a scientist. I deal in facts and data. But I know what I saw out there in those woods, and I know that I was lucky to make it out alive. I haven't been back to Six Rivers since that day. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can hear that unearthly howl echoing in the distance, and I wonder, what if they followed me home? Story 9. I was just a kid back in 2007, but that day in Clearwater Lake Provincial Park is seared into my memory forever. It was supposed to be a fun family camping trip, roasting marshmallows, hiking through nature, all that typical stuff. But what happened to me out there in those woods? I still get chills thinking about it. We had arrived at the campground earlier that day, my parents busy setting up the tent while my little sister ran around collecting pine cones. I was bored and restless after the long car ride, so I decided to explore a bit on my own. "Don't go too far," my mom called out as I headed towards one of the trails. "Be back in 30 minutes for lunch." The forest was peaceful at first, birds chirping, a gentle breeze rustling through the leaves. I breathed in the fresh air, feeling my mood lift as I wandered deeper into the trees. The trail curved around, leading me further from the campsite. I wasn't paying much attention to where I was going, just enjoying being out in nature. That's when I heard it. A strange, rhythmic thumping sound coming from up ahead. Curious, I crept forward, peering through the foliage to see what was making the noise. What I saw next made my blood run cold. There, in a small clearing about 50 feet away, was the most terrifying creature I've ever laid eyes on. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark, matted fur from head to toe. The thing was standing upright like a person, but there was nothing human about it. Its body was massively muscular, with long arms that hung down past its knees. The head was slightly pointed at the top, set on broad, sloping shoulders. I couldn't make out many facial features through the fur, but I caught a glimpse of dark eyes set deep in its skull. The creature was facing slightly away from me, focused intently on a large tree. As I watched in silent horror, it reached out with one massive hand and began scraping at the bark, peeling off long strips. Then it balled up its fist and started pounding on the trunk, creating that thumping sound I'd heard. I was frozen in place, unable to move or make a sound. Part of me was fascinated, trying to process what I was seeing, but mostly I was terrified beyond belief. This thing, whatever it was, seemed impossibly strong. Those huge arms looked like they could snap me in half without effort. Suddenly, the creature paused in its assault on the tree. It went very still for a moment, then slowly turned its head in my direction. Our eyes met, and in that instant, true panic set in. I let out an involuntary whimper of fear. The creature's eyes widened slightly at the sound. Then it took a single lumbering step in my direction. That was all it took to shock me out of my paralysis. I spun around and ran as fast as my legs could carry me, crashing through the underbrush in blind terror. Branches whipped at my face and I tripped over roots, but I didn't slow down. All I could think was that I had to get away from that thing. I have no idea how long I ran for. It felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Eventually I burst out of the trees near our campsite, tears streaming down my face as I gasped for air. My mom rushed over, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't form words to explain. I just sobbed and pointed back towards the forest. My dad grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, but of course found nothing. They tried to calm me down, assuming I'd just gotten spooked by normal forest noises. But I knew what I'd seen. That creature was real, and it was unlike anything that should exist in this world. The rest of that camping trip was miserable for me. I refused to go anywhere near the tree line. At night, every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me think the monster was coming for us. I barely slept, huddled in my sleeping bag and jumping at every sound. It's been years now, but I've never forgotten that day. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I know the truth. There are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation. I saw one with my own eyes, and it haunts me to this day. I've done research since then, trying to make sense of what I encountered. The closest thing I can compare it to is what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but those always seemed like silly campfire stories to me before. Now I'm not so sure. The level of detail is seared into my brain, the way its muscles rippled under that coarse fur as it moved, the strange elongated shape of its head, those penetrating eyes that seemed far too intelligent for an animal. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, the image of it turning to look at me replaying in vivid detail. I've never told many people about this. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw that day was real. There are things out there in the dark corners of the world that we can't explain. I just count myself lucky that I got away. But part of me wonders, what if it had decided to chase me? What if next time someone else isn't so fortunate? All I know is that I'll never look at the forest the same way again. There are monsters hiding among the trees, waiting to be discovered. And once you've seen one face to face, you can never unsee it. That day changed me forever, leaving me with questions I'm not sure I want answered. But I'll never forget my terrifying encounter with the creature in Clearwater Lake Provincial Park. Story 10. I'll never forget that day in April 1981. It was my 9th birthday, and I was outside tinkering with the pedal on my bike in front of our house in St. Ambrose. The spring air was crisp, and I remember feeling excited about the cake and presents waiting for me inside. Little did I know, I was about to receive an unforgettable gift that would haunt me for years to come. As I crouched down, fiddling with the loose bike pedal, I suddenly heard my aunt and grandmother screaming from the porch. At first, I thought they were just messing around, maybe getting ready to surprise me with something for my birthday. But when I looked up and saw the genuine terror on their faces, I knew something was seriously wrong. They were pointing frantically towards the tree line at the edge of our property, about 50 yards away. My eyes followed their gestures, and that's when I saw it. A creature unlike anything I'd ever seen before or since. It was tall and thin, with impossibly long arms that hung down past its knees. The creature's body was covered in shaggy fur, a light grayish-brown color that seemed to shimmer slightly in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. Its face was hard to make out clearly at that distance, but I could see that it had a somewhat flattened nose and deep-set eyes. The strangest thing was how still it stood, just watching us. It didn't make any aggressive moves or threatening gestures. It simply observed, as if just as curious about us as we were about it. I remember being frozen in place, my hands still gripping my bike pedal. Part of me wanted to run screaming into the house, but another part was utterly transfixed by this bizarre sight. The creature and I locked eyes for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. In that moment, I didn't feel fear exactly. It was more a sense of awe mixed with disbelief. How could something like this exist? And why had I never heard of anything like it before? My aunt's terrified shrieks finally snapped me out of my trance-like state. She was yelling for me to get inside immediately. I scrambled to my feet, my bike forgotten on the lawn, and ran towards the porch as fast as my legs could carry me. As I reached the steps, I risked one more glance back towards the woods. The creature was gone, vanished as silently and mysteriously as it had appeared. Inside, the house was in chaos. My grandmother was on the phone, her voice shaky as she tried to explain what we'd seen to my parents, who were out running last-minute errands for my birthday party. My aunt was pacing back and forth, muttering about calling the police or animal control. I sat on the couch, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I'd just witnessed. It felt surreal, like a dream, but the panic around me confirmed that it had been all too real. When my parents finally arrived home about 20 minutes later, they found a very different scene than the cheerful birthday celebration they'd been expecting. My dad listened intently as my aunt and grandmother recounted what they'd seen, his brow furrowed with concern and disbelief. To his credit, he took the situation seriously. He and my uncle grabbed some flashlights and headed out to investigate the area where we'd spotted the creature. I begged to go with them, my curiosity overriding my lingering fear, but they insisted I stay inside with my mom and the others. The wait felt interminable. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of it. One detail that stood out was the lack of any odor. I'd always heard stories about Bigfoot having a strong, musky smell, but I hadn't noticed anything like that. Of course, I hadn't been very close to it, but still, it seemed odd. When my dad and uncle finally returned, their expressions were grim. They hadn't seen the creature itself, but they had found something else. Footprints. Large, humanoid footprints that didn't match any known animal in the area. My uncle, always the practical one, had the presence of mind to make a plaster cast of one of the clearest prints. I remember watching in fascination as he carefully poured the mixture into the impression, preserving this tangible piece of evidence. The rest of the day passed in a blur. My birthday celebration felt hollow and forced, overshadowed by the morning's events. The adults tried to put on a brave face for my sake, but I could sense their unease. Every little noise from outside made everyone jump. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring out my window at the dark woods beyond. Part of me hoped to catch another glimpse of the creature, while another part dreaded the very thought. When I finally drifted off to sleep, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and piercing eyes. In the days and weeks that followed, our encounter became something of a local sensation. Word spread quickly in our small town, and soon reporters from nearby cities were showing up, eager for interviews and photos. My uncle's plaster cast became a prized piece of evidence, examined by various self-proclaimed experts and cryptozoology enthusiasts. But as time passed, the excitement began to fade. No one else reported any similar sightings in the area. The footprint cast, passed around to various researchers, was eventually lost or misplaced. Without any further evidence, many people began to doubt our story or suggest we had simply misidentified a bear or some other common animal. Even within my own family, opinions were divided. My aunt and grandmother remained adamant about what they'd seen, while others began to question their memories. Had the shock and surprise of the moment caused them to exaggerate or misinterpret? As for me, I knew what I had seen. The image of that creature was seared into my memory, as vivid now as it was on that April day over 40 years ago. But as I grew older, I learned to be cautious about sharing my experience. Too often I was met with skepticism or outright mockery. The encounter changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. It opened my eyes to the possibility that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than we typically assume. I became fascinated with cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena, devouring every book and article I could find on the subject. But it also left me with a lingering sense of unease. Every time I'm in the woods, a part of me is on high alert, scanning the trees for any sign of that tall, thin figure. The rational part of my brain knows how unlikely another encounter would be, but that childhood experience taught me that sometimes the impossible becomes reality. I've often wondered about the creature's intentions that day. Why did it show itself to us? Was it merely curious, or did it have some other purpose? And why have I never seen or heard of anything quite like it since? These questions have haunted me for decades. I've reached out to other eyewitnesses over the years, searching for anyone who might have seen something similar. While I've heard many fascinating stories of Bigfoot encounters, none quite match what I saw that day in St. Ambrose. Sometimes, in my darker moments, I question my own memories. Could I have somehow misinterpreted what I saw? But then, I remember the look in that creature's eyes, the impossible length of its arms, the way it seemed to simply melt back into the forest. No, this was something truly extraordinary. I've returned to St. Ambrose a few times over the years, drawn by a mix of nostalgia and the faint hope of finding some answers. The town has changed, of course. New houses, new faces. The woods where we saw the creature have been partially cleared for development. It saddens me to think that we might be destroying the habitat of something so rare and remarkable, if indeed it still exists in the area. On my last visit, I hiked out to where I believe we had our encounter. Standing there, surrounded by the sounds of the forest, I felt a familiar prickle of awareness on the back of my neck. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought I glimpsed a flash of grayish-brown fur between the trees, but it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure it wasn't just my imagination playing tricks on me. As I've grown older, I've come to accept that I may never fully understand what happened that day. The creature I saw doesn't fit neatly into any known category, not quite a traditional Bigfoot, not quite anything else. It remains a mystery, a glimpse into the unknown that has shaped my life in countless ways. I still celebrate my birthday each year, but it's always tinged with the memory of that incredible encounter. In a way, it was the most remarkable gift I've ever received. A reminder that the world is full of wonders and mysteries, if only we keep our eyes open to them. To this day, whenever I'm in the woods, a part of me is that 9-year-old boy again, heart racing with a mix of fear and excitement, wondering what might be watching from just beyond the trees. And sometimes, when the wind rustles through the leaves just right, I could swear I hear the soft footfalls of something large and unknown, moving silently through the forest. Story 11. I was just a young man of 17 back in November of 1941. Times were different then. We didn't have all the restrictions on hunting that exist nowadays. I'd grown up learning to hunt from my father and uncles, and that crisp autumn day, I set out alone near Basket Lake, west of Gypsumville in Manitoba, hoping to bag my first elk. The forest was quiet that morning, a light dusting of early snow on the ground. I remember the crunch of my boots and the fog of my breath in the chill air as I made my way through the trees, rifle at the ready. I'd been out for a couple hours with no luck when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart started racing as I spotted a large, dark shape moving between the trees about 50 yards away. From that distance, and in the dim light filtering through the branches, I was sure it was the elk I'd been hoping for. Without hesitation, I raised my rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot rang out, and I saw the figure stumble and fall. Elated at my success, I hurried forward, eager to claim my prize. But as I got closer, a sense of unease began to creep over me. Something wasn't right about the shape on the ground. When I was about 20 feet away, I stopped dead in my tracks. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. It wasn't an elk at all. The creature sprawled on the forest floor was something I'd never seen before, something that shouldn't exist. It was humanoid in shape, but massive, easily 7 feet tall. The body was covered in thick, dark brown fur. The limbs were long and powerful-looking, ending in enormous hands with black palms. The feet were huge and flat, like a man's but much larger. The face is what terrified me most. It was ape-like, with a pronounced brow and wide, flat nose. But there was an unsettling intelligence in its eyes as they stared blankly up at the sky. This was no animal, at least not one that should exist in the forests of Manitoba. I stood there frozen, my mind reeling as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of unknown primate? A missing link? My thoughts raced to tales I'd heard as a child of Bigfoot and Sasquatch. But those were just stories, weren't they? A wave of nausea and panic washed over me as the reality of what I'd done sunk in. I'd killed something unknown to science. Something that looked disturbingly human-like. What would happen if anyone found out? Would I be in trouble for hunting without a license? Would they think I was crazy? Or worse, would they believe me and want to study this thing? Images flashed through my mind of government agents swarming the woods, of being interrogated, of my quiet life being turned upside down. I knew in that moment that I could never tell anyone what had happened here. The risks were too great. With shaking hands, I shouldered my rifle and turned away from the creature's body. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I forced myself to walk calmly and steadily, retracing my steps through the woods. My mind was in turmoil as I made my way back to my truck. Part of me felt I should report this, that it could be an important scientific discovery, but a larger part was simply terrified of the consequences. What if there were more of these creatures out there? What if they came looking for their fallen comrade? I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. That night, I barely slept, plagued by nightmares of glowing eyes watching me from the woods and massive fur-covered hands reaching for me in the dark. In the days and weeks that followed, I was constantly on edge. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow at night had me jumping. I kept expecting someone to come knocking at my door, either the authorities to arrest me or some shadowy government agents to interrogate me about what I'd seen. But nothing happened. Life went on as normal in our small town. No reports of strange creatures found in the woods, no mysterious disappearances. It was as if that day had never happened at all. As time passed, I began to question my own memories. Had it really been as big as I remembered? Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe the shock of the moment had caused my mind to play tricks on me, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen. The image of that creature was burned into my mind, the intelligence in its eyes, the human-like hands, the sheer wrongness of its existence. For decades I kept this secret bottled up inside me. I never went hunting again after that day. I couldn't bring myself to go back into those woods. Even as an old man now, I still sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the memory as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. I don't know why I'm finally sharing this story now. Maybe it's the knowledge that I don't have many years left, and I need to unburden myself of this secret I've carried for so long. Maybe it's because the world seems more open to the possibility of unknown creatures these days. All I know is that something is out there in the wilderness of Manitoba, something that defies explanation, something that perhaps should remain hidden. To anyone reading this who might be tempted to go looking, be careful. There are things in this world that we aren't meant to understand. Things that, once seen, can never be unseen. I've lived with this knowledge for over 80 years now. The memory of that day has haunted me, shaped the course of my entire life. I've often wondered what became of the creature's body. Did scavengers destroy all trace of it? Did others of its kind find it and hide it away? Or is it still out there, waiting to be discovered and shock the world as it shocked me so long ago? I'll likely never know the answers to these questions, but I do know that I'll carry the weight of what happened that day to my grave. It's a burden I've borne in silence all these years, and one that I caution others against seeking out. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some secrets better left buried in the depths of the forest. Story 12. I'd been up in the stand for a few hours already, scanning the darkening forest with my night vision scope. The woods were eerily quiet. No wind, no birds, just the occasional rustle of leaves. I decided to try using my moose call to see if I could lure one in. As I raised the call to my lips, movement in my peripheral vision caught my eye. At first I thought it was the moose I'd been waiting for, but as I swung my scope over, I realized with a jolt that this was no moose. The creature moved with an uncanny speed and grace through the underbrush, far too quickly for its massive size. And it was massive, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, with long, powerful limbs and a hulking frame that I estimated had to weigh at least 350 pounds. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. It was a Sasquatch, a young one based on its proportions, but still larger than any man. Its entire body was covered in shaggy reddish-brown fur that seemed to shimmer slightly in my night vision. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the creature would hear it, but it showed no sign of noticing me up in the tree stand. Instead, it loped along on 2 legs with a fluid, rolling gait, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It moved to a clearing about 50 yards away and paused, lifting its head to sniff the air. The profile of its face made my skin crawl. It was disturbingly human-like, with a flattened nose and heavy brow, but the proportions were all wrong. The eyes were too large, set deep under that prominent brow ridge. For several long moments it stood motionless, alert and wary. Then its head swiveled in my direction, and I found myself staring directly into its eyes. They glowed with an eerie green reflection in my night vision, but I could sense the intelligence behind them. This was no mere animal. There was self-awareness in that gaze. I don't know how long we stayed locked in that stare down. It felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or 2. I was terrified, but also utterly captivated. I'd heard stories of Sasquatch encounters before, but had always been skeptical. Now here I was, face to face with one, and I couldn't look away. Eventually the creature made a low huffing sound and took a step towards my tree. I instinctively reached for my rifle, but something made me hesitate. The Sasquatch wasn't acting aggressive. If anything, it seemed curious. It took another few steps forward, moving with surprising stealth for such a large being. Now it was close enough that I could make out more details: the shape of its broad, sloping shoulders, the way its long arms hung below its knees, the arch of its feet that were so similar to a human's and yet subtly different. My fingers tightened on my rifle, but I still didn't raise it. Some primal instinct told me that shooting would be a grave mistake. So I sat motionless, barely daring to breathe as the Sasquatch drew nearer. When it was about 20 yards from my tree, it stopped again and tilted its head, studying me intently. I got the uncanny feeling it was assessing whether I was a threat. My .30-06 rifle suddenly felt woefully inadequate against this towering creature. To my shock, the Sasquatch then sat down on its haunches, still watching me. It seemed almost relaxed, as if it had decided I wasn't dangerous. I found myself relaxing slightly too, though my nerves were still on high alert. For the next half hour or so, we engaged in a surreal standoff. The Sasquatch would occasionally shift position or reach out to idly pull up tufts of grass, but its gaze rarely left me. I remained frozen, afraid any movement might spook it. As time wore on, my fear gradually gave way to wonder. Here was a creature that wasn't supposed to exist, and yet it was right in front of me, as real as anything. I found myself marveling at its humanoid features, the expressiveness of its face, the dexterity of its hands as it manipulated objects. At one point, it let out a series of low whoops and grunts. The vocalizations were unlike anything I'd heard before, not quite human, not quite ape, but somewhere in between. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Just when I was starting to think this strange encounter might last all night, the Sasquatch's head suddenly jerked to the side. Its nostrils flared and its muscles tensed. In one fluid motion it rose to its feet, gave me one last inscrutable look, and then melted into the shadows of the forest. I strained my ears but couldn't hear a sound as it vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone without a trace. I sat in stunned silence for a long time afterwards, trying to process what I'd just experienced. When I finally climbed down from my stand on shaky legs, the forest felt different, charged somehow, as if the very air was alive with secrets. I searched the area where the Sasquatch had been sitting, but found no tracks or hair. The ground was too hard and leaf-covered. I never saw the creature again after that night. But the memory of our encounter is seared into my mind. Those eyes especially, so human and yet not human at all. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling that penetrating gaze on me. I've told a few people about what happened, but most just laugh it off or look at me like I'm crazy. I don't blame them. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw. That Sasquatch was as real as you or me. The experience changed me profoundly. I gave up hunting after that. Couldn't bring myself to kill after looking into those eyes. I find myself drawn back to those woods often, hoping for another glimpse. But so far, the forest has kept its secrets. I'm left with so many questions. Where did it come from? Are there more out there? How have they remained hidden for so long? But I'm also left with a sense of wonder and humility. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, mysteries still waiting to be unraveled. That night in the Manitoba wilderness, I came face to face with the unknown. And while part of me is still shaken by the encounter, a bigger part of me is grateful. Grateful to have experienced something so profound, so outside the realm of everyday existence. It was terrifying, yes, but also magical in a way I can't fully articulate. I don't expect anyone to believe my story, but I know what I saw, and I'll carry that knowledge and that lingering sense of awe with me for the rest of my days. Story 13. I'll never forget that day in the summer of '72. I was just a kid, barely 11 years old, living in the small town of Grand Rapids, Manitoba. It was one of those lazy summer afternoons where time seemed to stretch on forever. My buddies and I had been riding our bikes along Highway 6, about 2 or 3 miles south of town. We often explored the woods and fields around there, looking for adventure. That day, I had pedaled ahead of my friends and decided to take a break near a ditch off the side of the road. As I was catching my breath, I noticed something moving in the undergrowth about 50 yards away. At first, I thought it was just a big black bear foraging for berries. We saw bears pretty often in those parts, so I wasn't too concerned. But something felt off. The way it was moving didn't seem quite right for a bear. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to get a closer look. I picked up a couple of small rocks, figuring I could toss them to scare it off if needed. As I crept closer, my heart started racing. This thing was massive, way bigger than any bear I'd ever seen. When I was about 30 feet away, I couldn't contain myself anymore. I let out a shout and threw one of the rocks in its direction, not aiming to hit it, just to get its attention. That's when everything changed. The creature slowly stood up and up and up. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized what I was seeing. This thing was enormous, easily 14 or 15 feet tall. It turned to face me, and I froze in terror. This was no bear. Its body was incredibly muscular, covered in light brown hair. The arms were unbelievably thick, like tree trunks or oil drums. I remember thinking they looked strong enough to snap a person in half without even trying. The face was almost human-like, but with a heavy brow and a wide, flat nose. Its eyes were dark and intelligent, fixed right on me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear and awe. This creature, this Bigfoot, I guess you'd call it, was real, and it was right in front of me. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. I kept waiting for it to charge at me, or roar, or do something aggressive, but it didn't. It just watched me with those eerily intelligent eyes. In a moment of pure insanity or bravery, I'm still not sure which, I slowly raised my hand and gave a small wave. I don't know why I did it. Maybe some part of my brain thought if I showed I was friendly, it wouldn't hurt me. To my utter amazement, the creature's expression seemed to soften slightly. It didn't wave back or anything, but the tension in the air eased a bit. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked into the dense forest. Its movements were smooth and deliberate, nothing like the lumbering gait you'd expect from something so large. I stood there for I don't know how long, trying to process what had just happened. My legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand. When I finally snapped out of it, I ran back to my bike and pedaled home faster than I ever had before. I didn't tell anyone what I saw for years. Who would believe me? A kid claiming to have seen a 15-foot-tall hairy man creature in the woods of Manitoba? I'd be laughed out of town. So I kept it to myself, replaying the encounter in my mind over and over. As I got older, I started to doubt my own memory. Maybe it was just a bear, and my young imagination had run wild. Maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, but deep down, I knew what I saw was real. I've spent countless hours researching Bigfoot sightings and theories since then. I've read about encounters all over North America that sound eerily similar to mine. It's both comforting and unsettling to know I'm not alone in what I experienced. Looking back, I'm struck by how peaceful the encounter was. This creature could have easily harmed me if it wanted to, but it didn't. There was an intelligence in its eyes, a sense of curiosity that mirrored my own. It's made me wonder about what other mysteries might be out there in the wilderness, just waiting to be discovered. I'm 62 now, and I've never seen anything like it again. I've gone back to that spot many times over the years, hoping for another glimpse, but no luck. Sometimes I wonder if it was a once-in-a-lifetime thing, a moment when the veil between our world and something else briefly lifted. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. Hell, there are days I still have trouble believing it myself, but I know what I saw that summer day in 1972. It was real, it was incredible, and it changed my life forever. To this day, whenever I'm in the woods, I find myself scanning the tree line, hoping to catch another glimpse of that magnificent creature. Part of me hopes I never do. The memory of that encounter is both thrilling and terrifying. But another part of me longs to see it again, to confirm that it wasn't just a childhood fantasy. I've never been able to shake the feeling that there's more to our world than we understand. That creature, whatever it was, shouldn't exist according to science. But it does. Or at least it did that day. It makes me wonder what other impossibilities might be out there just waiting to be discovered. Sometimes late at night I can still see those eyes staring back at me, intelligent, curious, and somehow sad, like it knew something I didn't. like it was carrying the weight of a secret too big for this world. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that day, but I do know that it changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. And while that can be scary, it's also incredibly exciting. So if you're ever out in the wilderness, keep your eyes open and your mind even more so. You never know what you might encounter. And if you do happen to come face to face with something unexplainable, remember, sometimes the best thing you can do is just wave and let it be. There's magic in this world if we're willing to see it. Story 14. I'll never forget that day in April 2004. It was supposed to be just another routine haul, driving my manure truck down those lonely back roads near Fisher Branch. The job ain't glamorous, but it pays the bills. I've been doing this route for years, so I know every bump and turn like the back of my hand. It was a cold, gray afternoon. Snow still covered the fields, even though it was spring. The kind of day where you just want to get the job done and head home. I was about halfway through my route, cruising down one of those dead-end roads east of Lake Sleeve. Nothing but empty fields and forests as far as the eye could see. I wasn't paying much attention, just focused on the road ahead and thinking about what I'd have for dinner that night. But then something caught my eye off to the right, maybe 100 meters out in a snow-covered field. At first I thought it was just a tree stump or something, but as I got closer, I realized it was moving. I slowed the truck down a bit, squinting to get a better look. What I saw next made my blood run cold. There was a creature standing out there in the field. And when I say standing, I mean bolt upright on two legs, like a person. But this was no person. It was massive, had to be at least 8 feet tall. The shoulders were incredibly broad and muscular looking. The arms hung down way longer than a human's would, almost to its knees. The whole body was covered in what looked like dark fur or hair. But the thing that really got me was the head. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. No snout or anything, just a face that looked almost human-like, but not quite right. As I drove by, this thing just stood there, stock still, watching my truck. I could feel its eyes on me. It didn't move a muscle, didn't make any noise, just stared. I've never felt so unsettled in my life. Now I've lived in these parts my whole life. I know what a bear looks like, even standing up. This was no bear, no moose, no elk, nothing I'd ever encountered before. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I wanted to stop the truck and get a better look, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep driving, so that's what I did. I kept my eyes on the road and my foot on the gas, but I could still feel that thing's gaze boring into me as I passed. Once I was about a half-mile down the road, I finally worked up the courage to look in my side mirror. The creature was gone, vanished without a trace. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, but I know what I saw. I finished my route in a daze, barely able to focus on driving. When I got home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I paced around my living room for hours, replaying the encounter over and over in my head. Should I tell someone? Would anyone even believe me? In the end, I decided to keep it to myself. Who's going to believe some manure truck driver saw a giant, hairy, humanoid creature out in the middle of nowhere? I'd probably just get laughed out of town. But I know what I saw that day. And in the years since, I've heard whispers. Other folks in the area who've had strange encounters in the woods. Glimpses of something big moving through the trees. Weird howls in the night. Makes me wonder if I'm not the only one who's seen this thing. I still drive that same route, week after week. Every time I pass that field, I can't help but slow down and scan the tree line. Part of me hopes I'll see it again, just to prove to myself I'm not crazy. But a bigger part of me prays I never lay eyes on that creature again as long as I live. It's been almost 20 years now, but I remember that day like it was yesterday. The image of that thing standing there watching me is burned into my brain. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling those eyes on me. I don't know what it was. Bigfoot, some undiscovered species, or something else entirely. But I know it was real, and I know it's still out there somewhere. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was just a really weird-looking bear, or maybe the light was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know that's not true. What I saw that day was something different, something that shouldn't exist. It's changed the way I see the world, made me realize there are things out there we can't explain, things that defy everything we think we know. I used to laugh at all those Bigfoot stories and cryptid sightings. Now, I'm not so quick to dismiss them. I still get a chill down my spine every time I drive past that field. Even on bright sunny days, it feels different there, like there's a heaviness in the air, a sense that something's watching, waiting. I always breathe a little easier once it's in my rearview mirror. Sometimes I think about trying to find it again, maybe set up some trail cams or something. But then I remember the fear I felt that day, the way my whole body screamed at me to get away. And I realize some things are better left alone. I've never told anyone this story before, partly because I was afraid no one would believe me, but mostly because saying it out loud makes it real, forces me to confront the fact that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows, just out of sight. So I keep it to myself, go about my days, drive my routes, live my life. But I'm always watching, always alert, because I know now that the impossible is possible, and that creature, whatever it was, is still out there somewhere, waiting, watching, and maybe, just maybe, one day I'll see it again. Until then, I'll keep this secret, keep driving those lonely back roads, and hope that whatever I saw that day stays far, far away. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some creatures are better left undiscovered, and some encounters are better left in the past, where they can't haunt your dreams or shake your reality. But no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget that day in April 2004. The day I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. The day I realized the world is a much stranger, much more terrifying place than we ever imagined. And the day I learned that sometimes the unknown is better left unknown. Story 15. It was a Friday, and I remember feeling restless after dinner. My folks were watching TV, but I couldn't sit still. The wind was howling something fierce outside, rattling the windows. I told my parents I was heading out for a bit, maybe meet up with some friends. They warned me to be careful in the dark and bundle up against the cold. I set out walking, not really sure where I was going. The streets were pretty empty. Most folks were probably cozied up inside on a night like that. The wind whipped dead leaves around my feet as I walked. Before I knew it, I found myself near Yellow Quill School. The school grounds were quiet and dark. On impulse, I cut across the empty parking lot toward the football field. Maybe I'd just sit in the bleachers for a bit, collect my thoughts. As I approached the field, I noticed a dark figure standing near one of the basketball hoops. At first I thought it was just some guy, maybe another restless teen or a homeless person. But something felt off. The figure was unnaturally still, and as I got closer, I realized it was way too tall to be a normal person. My heart started racing, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept forward, straining my eyes in the dim light. When I was about 30 feet away, I froze in my tracks. What I was seeing couldn't be real. This thing had to be 10 or 12 feet tall. Its body was covered in short, dark hair. The arms were insanely long, with huge hands that hung down almost to its knees. The creature's profile was eerily straight, no slouch or hunch like you'd expect from something that big. It was just standing there motionless next to the basketball hoop, which suddenly looked tiny in comparison. I stood there paralyzed, afraid to move a muscle. A part of my brain was screaming at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. Despite its massive size, the creature didn't seem aggressive. It just stood there, as still as a statue. The wind had died down, and the silence was deafening. I could hear my own ragged breathing and pounding heartbeat. Time seemed to stand still as I stared at this impossible being. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two, I managed to take a shaky step backward. The crunch of gravel under my foot sounded impossibly loud in the quiet night. The creature's head snapped toward me, faster than I would have thought possible for something so large. I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes, reflecting what little light there was. That was enough to break the spell. I turned and ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. I didn't stop until I reached my house, lungs burning and legs shaking. I burst through the front door, startling my parents. They asked what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words to explain. How could I tell them what I'd seen? They'd never believe me. I mumbled something about getting spooked by shadows and went straight to my room. I lay awake all night, replaying the encounter in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring at me. The next day, I went back to the school, half expecting to see giant footprints or some other evidence. But there was nothing. The basketball hoop stood undamaged, the ground unmarked. If it weren't for the vivid memory seared into my brain, I might have convinced myself it was all a dream. I spent the next few weeks on edge, jumping at every shadow. I avoided going out at night and started taking the long way to school to avoid passing the football field. My parents noticed the change in my behavior, but I brushed off their concerns. As time passed and nothing else happened, I started to relax a bit. But I never forgot what I saw that night. I've spent years trying to rationalize it, to explain it away. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, but none of the descriptions quite match what I encountered. This wasn't some lumbering ape man. It was something other, more alien than animal. I'm 62 now, and I've never told anyone the full story until now. People in town would think I was crazy, and my family would worry. But I need to get this off my chest. That night in 1976 changed me forever. I know there are things out there beyond our understanding, things that defy explanation. Sometimes when the wind howls on dark October nights, I find myself looking out the window, half expecting to see that tall, dark figure standing silently in the distance. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I know it was real, and I'll carry that knowledge with me for the rest of my days. I still live in Portage-la-Prairie. I've thought about moving away many times over the years, but something always held me back. Maybe a part of me is still hoping for answers, for some explanation of what I saw that night. Or maybe I'm afraid that if I leave, I'll be running from something I can never truly escape. The encounter lasted only minutes, but it shaped decades of my life. I've become something of a loner, always a bit on edge, always watching the shadows. My relationships have suffered. It's hard to connect with people when you're carrying a secret like this. I've gone back to that football field countless times over the years, always half hoping and half dreading that I'll see the creature again. But it's never reappeared. Sometimes I wonder if it was some kind of interdimensional being just passing through our world for a moment. Other times I think maybe it was always there, hidden just beyond our perception, and for some reason on that night I was able to see it. The hardest part is not knowing what it was, where it came from, why it was there, not knowing if I'm the only one who's seen it, or if others have encountered it too, but are too afraid to speak up. Not knowing if I'll ever see it again, or if that one brief encounter was all I'll ever get. I've spent countless hours researching cryptids and unexplained phenomena, looking for anything that matches what I saw. But nothing quite fits. The height, the stillness, the way it moved. It was unlike anything I've ever read about or seen since. There are nights when I lie awake, replaying every detail of that encounter in my mind. The short, dark hair covering its body, the impossibly long arms, the straight posture that defied physics for something so tall, and those eyes, those glowing eyes that seemed to look right through me. I've often wondered what would have happened if I'd stayed longer, if I hadn't run away. Would it have communicated somehow? Would it have attacked? Or would it have simply vanished into the night, leaving me to question my sanity? The experience has left me with a profound sense of how little we truly understand about our world. We think we've got it all figured out, but there are mysteries out there that defy explanation. I've learned to keep an open mind, to question what I think I know. Sometimes I catch myself scanning crowds, looking for unusually tall people. Or I'll be walking in the woods and suddenly feel like I'm being watched. The encounter may have been brief, but its effects have lasted a lifetime. I'm sharing this now because I'm not getting any younger, and I don't want this secret to die with me. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar. Maybe this will give them the courage to speak up too, or maybe it'll just be dismissed as the ramblings of an old man. But I know what I saw, and I needed to tell my story. To this day, I can't look at a basketball hoop without remembering how small it looked next to that creature. I can't hear the wind howling without being transported back to that night. And I can't shake the feeling that there's more to our world than we can see or understand. I don't know if I'll ever get answers, but I do know that what I saw that night in 1976 was real, and it changed me forever. Whatever it was, Bigfoot, alien, interdimensional being, or something else entirely, it opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our comprehension, and that's a knowledge I'll carry with me until the day I die. Story 16. I'll never forget that evening in late October 2001. It was just another ordinary Wednesday, or so I thought. I was lounging on my couch, absent-mindedly flipping through channels on TV while waiting for my microwave dinner to finish cooking. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across my small apartment. I live on the third floor of an apartment complex that overlooks Lapau Park. It's usually pretty quiet around here, especially on weeknights. Most of my neighbors are retirees or young professionals who keep to themselves. I'd lived here for about 2 years at that point, and had settled into a comfortable routine. As I got up to check on my dinner, something caught my eye out the window. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fading light, maybe an oddly shaped shadow. But then it moved. My heart nearly stopped as I realized what I was seeing. There, walking across the park, was the largest, hairiest creature I'd ever laid eyes on. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its entire body was covered in dark, shaggy fur. The way it moved was unlike anything I'd seen before, a strange mix of ape-like and human-like motions. I froze, afraid to move or even breathe. Part of me wanted to run and hide, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The creature lumbered across the open grass, heading towards the wooded area at the edge of the park. Its long arms swung at its sides as it walked. Time seemed to stand still as I watched this impossible thing casually strolling through my neighborhood park. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of escaped zoo animal? A person in a costume? But deep down, I knew it was something else entirely. As the creature neared the tree line, it paused for a moment and seemed to look around. My blood ran cold as I realized it was turning in my direction. I ducked down below the windowsill, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. After a few terrifying seconds, I slowly peeked back out. The creature had disappeared into the woods. I stayed frozen by the window for what felt like hours, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the usual park scenery as night settled in. Eventually, the smell of my burnt TV dinner snapped me out of my daze. I spent that whole night pacing my apartment, jumping at every little sound. I kept replaying what I'd seen over and over, trying to convince myself there must be some logical explanation. But I knew what I saw. The next morning, I seriously considered calling in sick to work. I was exhausted from a sleepless night and felt on edge. But I decided I needed to get out of the apartment and try to return to some sense of normalcy. As I walked to my car, I noticed my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, out in her garden. She waved me over, looking excited about something. "You'll never believe what I saw last night," she exclaimed. My stomach dropped. Could she have seen it too? Mrs. Johnson went on to describe how she'd been looking out her back window the previous evening when she saw an enormous, hairy creature playing in a pile of leaves in her backyard. She said it was at least 7 or 8 feet tall and covered in dark fur. "At first I thought I was seeing things," she said. "But then my dog started going crazy, barking his head off at whatever that thing was. It looked right at us and then ran off into the woods faster than anything that big should be able to move." I felt a chill run down my spine as Mrs. Johnson recounted her experience. It matched up almost exactly with what I had seen. "Did you call the police?" I asked her. She shook her head. "Oh, honey, who would believe an old lady like me? They'd think I was going senile or something. I figured I must have imagined it, but it's nice to tell someone about it." I nodded, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her about my own sighting, but I was afraid of sounding crazy. And honestly, I was still trying to process it all myself. As the days went by, I kept expecting to hear news reports about some kind of monster sighting in the area. But there was nothing. Life in the neighborhood went on as usual. I found myself constantly on edge, especially when I was near the park. I started keeping my curtains closed at all times, afraid of what I might see if I looked out. For weeks, I had trouble sleeping, plagued by vivid nightmares of that creature. Over time, the intensity of the experience faded somewhat, but I've never been able to forget what I saw that evening. To this day, I find myself scanning the tree line whenever I'm near the park, half expecting to catch another glimpse of that impossible being. I've done some research over the years, trying to find any similar reports or explanations for what Mrs. Johnson and I witnessed. I've come across stories of Bigfoot sightings that sound eerily similar to our experiences, but I've never found any definitive answers. Sometimes I try to convince myself that it was all just an elaborate hoax or some kind of shared delusion, but deep down, I know what I saw was real. That creature was like nothing that should exist in this world, and yet there it was, casually strolling through a suburban park on an ordinary October evening. I've never told anyone else about this, afraid of being labeled as crazy or attention-seeking. But the memory of that night has stayed with me all these years. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can hear heavy footsteps and rustling leaves outside my window. And for a moment, I'm right back there, frozen in fear, as I watch an impossible creature lumber by. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened that night, or if I'll ever see anything like it again. But one thing's for sure. I'll never look at the woods behind my apartment the same way again. Every time I pass by, I can't help but wonder, is something out there watching me too? Story 17. I was a tow truck driver back in '99, working the lonely roads of northern Manitoba. That job could be mind-numbing at times, just hours of empty highway stretching out before you. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw that early morning in May. It was around 5:30 a.m., still dark out. I'd pulled over on Provincial Road 280 between Split Lake and Gillam to catch a quick nap. You know how it is on those long hauls. Sometimes you just need to close your eyes for a bit before the sun comes up. I was dozing in the cab when this weird noise jolted me awake. At first, I thought I was dreaming. My eyes adjusted to the pre-dawn gloom, and I saw something massive moving at the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This thing was huge, had to be 8 feet tall at least, probably 800 pounds or more. My brain was scrambling to process it. As my vision cleared, I could make out more details. It had dark, shaggy hair covering its body. The arms were unnaturally long, hanging down past its knees. But the face, that's what really got me. It looked almost human, but not quite, like some kind of ancient primate. I was frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe. It hadn't seemed to notice me yet. For a few seconds, it just stood there at the edge of the trees, perfectly still. Then its head swiveled, and those eyes locked right onto me. Time seemed to stop in that moment. I felt a chill go through my entire body. This was no bear or moose. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. Suddenly, it turned and started moving into the forest. But here's the creepy part. It kept looking back at me as it went. 3 or 4 times it turned its head, those eyes boring into me, like it was making sure I wasn't following. I don't know how long I sat there after it disappeared from view. Could have been seconds or minutes. I was in shock, my mind reeling. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, but I knew deep down this was real. When I finally snapped out of it, panic set in. I fired up the truck and tore out of there like a bat out of hell. I was doing at least 65-70 mph, way over what that old rig was built for. Didn't care if I blew the engine, I just had to get away. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel straight. Cold sweat was running down my back. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see that thing chasing after me. But the road behind me stayed empty. I didn't stop driving until I hit Thompson, a good 3 hours away. By then the sun was up and things felt more normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes watching me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. Maybe I'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs. But deep down I knew better. That thing was no ordinary animal. For weeks afterwards I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise outside would set me on edge. I kept replaying that encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of it. But there was no logical explanation. I heard rumors over the years of other sightings in that area. Truckers and hunters talking about a large, hair-covered creature in the woods. Most people laughed it off. But I knew the truth. To this day, I get chills thinking about that morning. I've never told many people about it. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw out there on PR 280. Something that isn't supposed to exist. Something that still haunts my dreams all these years later. I don't drive those northern roads anymore. Found work closer to Winnipeg where it's safer. But a part of me wonders if that creature is still out there, roaming those vast forests. And I pray I never cross paths with it again. Sometimes late at night, when the wind is howling outside, I swear I can hear that strange noise that woke me up that morning. And for a split second, I'm right back there in my truck, staring into those otherworldly eyes. I've tried to rationalize it over the years, tell myself it was just a bear or my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I know better. What I saw that day was real, and it's changed how I see the world. I used to scoff at stories of Bigfoot and other cryptids, thought it was all nonsense. But now I'm not so sure. There are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation, things that most people will never see or believe. I've done some research since then, trying to find similar accounts. And let me tell you, there are more stories out there than you'd think. People who've had encounters just like mine. Most are afraid to come forward, worried they'll be labeled crazy. But I know what I saw, and I know I'm not alone. That creature, whatever it was, is out there. And sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too. If somewhere in those northern woods, it's telling its own story about the strange human it encountered one early morning. I still have nightmares sometimes. I'll wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, convinced that thing is right outside my window. It takes me a while to calm down, to remind myself I'm safe. But am I really? That's the question that haunts me. If something like that exists, what else is out there that we don't know about? What other secrets do those vast northern forests hold? I've thought about going back, trying to find proof. But the fear always holds me back. What if I actually found it? What would I do then? Some mysteries are better left unsolved, so I stay here in the city, surrounded by the comforts of civilization. But a part of me will always be back on that lonely stretch of PR 280, locked in a staring contest with something that shouldn't exist. To those who haven't experienced something like this, it probably sounds crazy. I get that, but until you've been face to face with the unexplainable, you can't understand. It changes you, makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw that day, and I'll carry that memory with me for the rest of my life. So next time you're driving down a dark, lonely road in the middle of nowhere, keep your eyes open. You never know what might be watching from the shadows. And if you hear a strange noise in the night, think twice before you investigate. Some things are better left undiscovered. As for me, I'll keep telling my story. Maybe someday someone will believe me. Or maybe I'll find others who've had similar experiences. But until then, I'll just keep looking over my shoulder, always half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me from the darkness. Story 18. The day started like any other on the trail. I woke up early, packed my gear, and set off through the towering redwoods. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves overhead. I felt strong and alive, my muscles working smoothly after weeks on the trail. As evening approached, I started looking for a good campsite near water. I came across a beautiful little creek in a small valley and decided it was the perfect spot to settle in for the night. The sound of the running water was soothing, and there was a nice flat area to pitch my tent. I got to work setting up camp, looking forward to a relaxing evening. I had just started heating water for my freeze-dried dinner when I heard something that made me freeze. It was a low, guttural vocalization coming from the other side of the creek, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. My first thought was that it must be a bear, but it didn't sound quite right for that. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I stayed absolutely still, straining my ears. After a few moments of silence, I heard an answering call from further upstream. Two voices, communicating back and forth. My heart started racing as I realized these weren't normal animal sounds. They had an almost human quality to them, but deeper and more primitive somehow. I wanted to pack up and get out of there immediately, but I was afraid any movement would draw attention to myself. So I crouched there by my stove, barely breathing, as the vocalizations continued. They seemed to be getting closer. Suddenly there was a loud crack of breaking branches from just across the creek, maybe 50 feet away. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Whatever was over there was big, and it was moving through the underbrush with incredible power. I don't know how long I sat there paralyzed with fear. It felt like hours, but was probably only 20-30 minutes. Eventually the sounds moved further away and faded into the distance. I was shaking uncontrollably, my dinner long forgotten. I desperately wanted to break camp and hike out of there, but it was fully dark by that point. I knew trying to navigate the trail at night would be dangerous, so I forced myself to quickly eat some trail mix, then dove into my tent and zipped it up tight. I lay there wide awake all night, jumping at every little sound. My imagination was running wild, conjuring images of huge ape-like creatures lurking just outside the thin nylon walls. I kept telling myself it was just bears, or maybe even other hikers playing a prank. But deep down, I knew it was something else entirely. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I was up and packing my gear with trembling hands. I needed to see if there was any evidence of what had happened, but I also wanted to get the hell out of there as fast as possible. I cautiously made my way down to the creek, scanning the opposite bank. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, in a small sandbar, was a series of enormous footprints. They were clearly bipedal, but much larger than any human foot. I estimated them to be 16 to 17 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. The tracks led into an area of dense vegetation that had been heavily disturbed. Branches were snapped and plants flattened in a path at least 8 feet wide. Whatever made those prints was massive. I fumbled for my camera, hands shaking so bad I could barely operate it. I snapped a few photos of the prints and disturbed area, though in my panicked state I'm not sure how clear they turned out. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I shouldered my pack and practically ran up the trail, not slowing down for hours. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. There was no denying it. I had encountered not one, but 2 Bigfoot creatures. For years, I told almost no one about what happened that night. I was afraid people would think I was crazy or making it up. But the memory of those inhuman vocalizations and those massive footprints has stayed with me all this time. I've gone over it again and again in my head, looking for some other explanation. But I know what I heard and saw. There are things in this world that defy conventional explanation. I went into those woods as a skeptic and came out a believer. Sometimes I wonder if they knew I was there the whole time. Was I in danger, or were they just curious about this human intruder in their territory? I'll never know for sure, but I do know that I'll never forget that night by the creek, when my understanding of reality was fundamentally shaken. I still love hiking and being out in nature, but I'm much more aware now that we don't know everything about the wilderness. There are mysteries out there, and creatures that most people don't believe exist. I feel privileged, in a way, to have had such a close encounter. But I also feel a deep sense of unease knowing that these powerful, intelligent beings are out there, mostly unseen and unknown. If you're ever hiking in Northern California, keep your eyes and ears open. You never know what you might encounter in those ancient forests. And if you hear strange vocalizations at night, my advice is to pack up and get out of there quick. Some mysteries are better left unexplored. I still get chills thinking about how close I came to those creatures. The raw power in those vocalizations and the size of those footprints. It was humbling and terrifying. I've never felt so small and vulnerable as I did that night, realizing I was in the presence of something beyond my understanding. In the years since, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot sightings and encounters. I've connected with others who've had similar experiences. It's comforting to know I'm not alone, but it also reinforces the reality of what I went through. These creatures are out there, whether mainstream science accepts it or not. I often wonder about those 2 Bigfoot I encountered. Were they a mated pair? Parent and child? 2 males patrolling their territory? I'll never know, but I like to imagine them out there still, moving silently through the forests, living their lives mostly unseen by human eyes. That night changed me profoundly. It opened my eyes to the fact that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than we typically believe. I've become much more open-minded about other unexplained phenomena as a result. After all, if Bigfoot is real, what else might be out there that we don't yet understand? I still hike regularly, but I'm much more attuned to my surroundings now. Every snapped twig or distant sound catches my attention. Part of me hopes to have another encounter someday to confirm what I experienced, but another part of me is terrified of coming face to face with one of these creatures again. For anyone who doubts the existence of Bigfoot, I can only say this. I was once like you. I thought it was all hoaxes and misidentifications. But when you hear those vocalizations with your own ears, when you see those massive footprints with your own eyes, it changes everything. There are things in this world beyond our current understanding. I know because I've experienced them firsthand. That night in Trinity County will stay with me forever. It was terrifying, awe-inspiring, and utterly life-changing. I went into the wilderness seeking adventure and came out with a story I'm still trying to fully comprehend. All I know for certain is that I'm not the same person I was before that encounter. The world seems bigger now, full of possibilities and mysteries, and every time I step into the woods, I can't help but wonder, are they out there, watching me? Story 19. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The sun was still high, casting a golden glow over the reservoir. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the occasional cry of a bird. It was perfect, or so we thought. As we set up our tent, I noticed a fisherman on the other side of the reservoir. He seemed oddly large, even from a distance, but I didn't think much of it at the time. We were too busy laughing, stealing kisses, and enjoying our newfound freedom. As night fell, we built a small fire and roasted marshmallows. The stars came out, more brilliant than I'd ever seen them. We were miles from any town, and the darkness was almost absolute. It should have been romantic, but there was an underlying tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. It started with a scream. At first, we thought it was just an animal, maybe a mountain lion or a coyote, but it was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was high-pitched, almost human, but with a guttural quality that sent shivers down my spine. My girlfriend clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I tried to reassure her, but I was just as scared. We decided to call it a night and retreated to our tent, hoping that whatever made that sound was far away. But as we lay there in the darkness, the noises got closer. There were splashes in the water, too heavy to be fish, twigs snapping under immense weight, and that smell, a rank, musky odor that seemed to seep through the fabric of our tent. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. My girlfriend was shaking beside me, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. We were both too terrified to speak, afraid that any sound might draw attention to us. Then we saw it. A massive silhouette moved between us and the dying embers of our fire. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that nearly touched the ground. The moonlight glinted off what looked like wet fur. I knew then that the fisherman I'd seen earlier wasn't a man at all. This thing, whatever it was, had been watching us all along. It moved closer to our tent, and I could hear its breathing, deep, ragged breaths that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. The smell was overpowering now, a mix of wet dog and something far more primal and frightening. I felt a pressure on the side of the tent, as if it was reaching out to touch us. My girlfriend whimpered, and I clamped my hand over her mouth, terrified that any sound would provoke an attack. For what felt like hours, we lay there, frozen in fear. The creature circled our tent, occasionally letting out one of those bone-chilling screams. Each time it did, I felt it in my very core, a primal fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Just when I thought my heart might explode from sheer terror, the creature seemed to lose interest. The heavy footsteps retreated, the screams became more distant, and eventually, silence fell over the campsite once more. We didn't sleep a wink that night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, we scrambled out of the tent. The campsite was a mess, our supplies scattered, large footprints in the mud by the shore. And the smell, that awful, musky odor, still hung in the air. We packed up faster than I thought possible, our hands shaking so badly we could barely tie our shoelaces. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a large, dark shape watching us from the tree line. I stepped on the gas, and we didn't stop until we were miles away. It's been years since that night, but I still can't shake the memory. The terror, the helplessness, the realization that there are things out there we can't explain. I've read about Bigfoot sightings since then, and while part of me wants to dismiss it all as nonsense, I can't. Not after what we experienced. I've never been camping since that night. The sound of those screams, the feeling of being watched by something inhuman. It stayed with me all these years. Sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can still smell that musky odor, and my heart starts racing all over again. I don't know what we encountered that night at Spicer's Reservoir, but I do know this. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our forests. And once you've come face to face with them, you're never quite the same again. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Why did it leave us alone? Where did it go? These questions haunt me. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just a bear or some other known animal. But deep down, I know that's not true. What we encountered that night was something else entirely. I've never told this story to anyone outside of my immediate family. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. It was real, and it was terrifying. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, roaming the forests around Spicer's Reservoir. I wonder if other campers have had similar experiences. Part of me wants to go back, to try and find answers. But the fear is still too strong. I'm sharing this now because I need to get it off my chest. I need to know if anyone else has experienced something similar. Because until I have answers, I don't think I'll ever truly be at peace. That night changed me forever, and I'm still trying to understand why. So if you're planning a camping trip near Spicer's Reservoir, or anywhere in the remote wilderness, be careful, be aware, because you never know what might be watching you from the shadows. And once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. The memory will stay with you forever, just as it has stayed with me for all these years. Story 20. It was July 1977, and I had just turned 14. My brother was 16, and we were both excited to spend a week fishing and hiking in Mono County. We'd been coming to this spot for years, but this time felt different from the moment we arrived. The first couple days were great. We caught some nice trout and did some hiking around the lakes. But on the third day, everything changed. It was late afternoon, and Dad asked us to gather some firewood before dinner. My brother and I headed into the woods near our campsite, joking around and shoving each other like we always did. We'd been gathering wood for maybe 15 minutes when I started to get an uneasy feeling. The birds had gone quiet, and there was this heavy stillness in the air. I tried to shake it off, but then I heard it. Heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush, way too loud to be a deer or coyote. "Hey, did you hear that?" I whispered to my brother. He nodded, eyes wide. We both froze, straining to listen. The footsteps got closer, and I saw the bushes about 30 feet away start to shake violently. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Then my brother grabbed my arm and pointed. Rising above the bushes was a massive dark brown head moving fast. It was way too big to be a bear, and the way it moved was just wrong, unnatural. I don't know which one of us screamed first, but suddenly we were both yelling and running as fast as we could back towards our campsite. I've never run so hard in my life. Branches whipping my face, lungs burning. I could hear heavy footsteps crashing through the woods behind us. We burst out of the tree line and sprinted for our truck. My brother fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. I was crying, begging him to hurry. As soon as the engine roared to life, he slammed it into reverse and we peeled out of there. In his panic, my brother wasn't watching where he was going. We smashed into a tree, denting the tailgate, but he just threw it in drive and we tore down the dirt road, fishtailing around corners. When we got back to the main campground, we were both sobbing and yelling incoherently. Our dad came running up, asking what the hell happened. We tried to explain between gasps what we'd seen, but I don't think we were making much sense. Dad kept telling us to calm down, that it was probably just a bear. But we knew what we saw wasn't any normal animal. The size of it, the way it moved, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. We begged Dad to pack up and leave right then, but he insisted we were safe at the main campground. He wanted to go back to our site to get our gear, but my brother and I refused to go anywhere near those woods again. We slept in the truck that night, jumping at every sound. The next morning, Dad hiked back to our site alone to break down camp. He said he didn't see any signs of large animals, but I noticed he seemed shaken when he got back. We left that day and cut our trip short. For weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about what I'd seen in those woods. My brother and I tried to research what it could have been, but nothing quite fit. We'd hear stories over the years about Bigfoot sightings in California, and we'd look at each other knowingly. To this day, I can't explain what we encountered at Virginia Lakes. I've never been back there, and I avoid camping in secluded woods altogether now. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a bear, that we let our imaginations run wild. But then I remember the immense size of that head above the bushes, the unnatural way it moved, and I know in my gut it was something else entirely. I'm 60 years old now, but I still get chills thinking about that day. My brother passed away a few years ago, so I'm the only one left who remembers what really happened. I've never told anyone else the full story until now. Part of me hopes someone out there has had a similar experience and can help make sense of it. But mostly, I just needed to finally get this off my chest after all these years. Whatever was out there in those woods that day, I hope I never encounter anything like it again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, I suppose. But I'll carry the memory of that terrifying encounter with me for the rest of my days. Story 21. My girlfriend and I had driven up to Siskiyou County for a weekend of camping and botanizing. I was doing volunteer work, cataloging plant species in the area, and we thought it would make for a nice getaway. We found a secluded spot off a primitive trail to set up our tent, surrounded by towering redwoods and the soothing sounds of the nearby river. The first day went great. We hiked, I took notes on the local flora, and we enjoyed the serenity of being out in nature, away from the bustle of the city. As night fell, we cooked dinner over our small campfire and turned in relatively early, tired from the day's activities. I'm not sure how long we'd been asleep when I was jolted awake by a tremendous crashing sound coming from the creek bed about 50 yards from our campsite. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but the noises were far too loud and destructive for any bear I'd encountered before. It sounded like entire trees were being ripped out of the ground and thrown around. The ground seemed to shake with each impact. My girlfriend woke up too, and I could feel her trembling next to me as we listened in stunned silence. After a few minutes of this terrifying cacophony, everything suddenly went quiet. The normal nighttime sounds of the forest, crickets, frogs, owls, had all gone silent. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I sensed something was very wrong. That's when we heard it. The unmistakable sound of deliberate bipedal footsteps slowly approaching our tent. Whatever it was walking on two legs, and it was big. The footfalls were heavy, causing twigs and leaves to crunch loudly with each step. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to run, to get out of there as fast as possible, but I was paralyzed with fear. We were miles from the nearest road or town, totally isolated. The footsteps got closer and closer until they stopped right outside our tent. I could hear deep, raspy breathing, like something huge trying to catch its breath after exertion. The fabric of the tent moved slightly, as if something was sniffing at it. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I fumbled for our flashlight. With shaking hands, I turned it on and shone it at the shadow looming outside the tent. But the creature, whatever it was smart. It stayed just out of the beam of light, moving deliberately to avoid being illuminated. All we could see was a massive silhouette, easily 8 or 9 feet tall and incredibly broad. The breathing continued, deep and guttural. I caught a whiff of a strong, musky odor, unlike anything I'd smelled before. For what felt like an eternity, we sat frozen in terror as this thing circled our tent, always staying just out of the flashlight's beam. I kept moving the light, trying desperately to catch a glimpse of it, but it was too quick and careful. Eventually, after what must have been 20 or 30 minutes but felt like hours, we heard those heavy footsteps slowly retreating back into the forest. The creature let out a long, low vocalization as it left. Not quite a roar, not quite a howl, but something in between that made my blood run cold. We stayed awake the rest of the night, too terrified to even whisper to each other. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, we hurriedly packed up our campsite and got the hell out of there. On our way out, we saw the destruction in the creek bed, huge trees uprooted, boulders tossed aside like pebbles. No bear or mountain lion could have done that kind of damage. And the footprints, massive bare footprints pressed deep into the soft ground, easily 18 inches long. I'd always been skeptical about Bigfoot before that night. I was a man of science, after all. But after what we experienced, I knew without a doubt that these creatures were real. Nothing else could explain what we encountered. In the years since, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot encounters and joined some online communities dedicated to the subject. I've heard many similar stories from others who've had run-ins with these elusive creatures, but I've never shared my own experience publicly until now. I still go camping and hiking, but never again in that part of Siskiyou County. And I always keep my eyes and ears open when I'm in the wilderness, knowing that there are things out there we still don't fully understand. That night changed my entire worldview and left me with a deep respect for the mysteries that still exist in our forests. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of those footsteps and that otherworldly vocalization echoing in my mind. I don't know why that creature approached us that night or why it ultimately left us unharmed, but I do know that I'll never forget the sheer terror of those hours in that tent, certain that at any moment we might come face to face with something that wasn't supposed to exist. I've tried to rationalize it over the years, to come up with some other explanation for what we experienced, but deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy conventional explanation, creatures that have eluded scientific classification. I just hope that someday we can learn to coexist with them peacefully, rather than living in fear of chance encounters in the dark of night. For now, though, I'll continue to share my story, hoping that it might help others who've had similar experiences feel less alone. And maybe, just maybe, it'll encourage more people to keep an open mind about the mysteries that still exist in our world. Because trust me, once you've been face to face with the unknown like that, it changes you forever. Story 22. I'd been driving for hours and really needed to use the bathroom, but there weren't any rest stops or gas stations around. Finally, I couldn't hold it anymore and decided to pull over on the side of the road. I figured I could just duck into the woods real quick to relieve myself. As soon as I stepped out of the car, I felt uneasy. The forest was pitch black beyond the reach of my headlights and unnaturally quiet. No crickets chirping or owls hooting, just dead silence. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I really had to go, so I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and ventured a little ways into the trees. I had only gone about 20 feet in when I heard a twig snap loudly behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding, and shone my flashlight in that direction. At first I didn't see anything, but then my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. Standing there, partially hidden behind a tree, was some kind of creature. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in dark, matted fur. The beam of my flashlight reflected off 2 glowing eyes, set in a face that looked almost human, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off, the features twisted into something inhuman. I stood there frozen in terror as the thing took a step towards me. It was holding what looked like a thick tree branch in one massive clawed hand. Another step, and now it was only about 10 feet away. I could smell its rank, musky odor. Suddenly it opened its mouth and let out a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in my chest. That broke me out of my paralysis, and I bolted back towards my car as fast as I could run. I could hear heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind me. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and fumbled with shaking hands to get the key in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the creature emerge from the tree line. It stood there at the edge of the road, still clutching that branch, and stared right at me with those glowing eyes. I floored it and tore out of there, tires squealing. For miles afterwards, I kept checking my mirrors, terrified I would see it chasing after me. But there was nothing there, just empty road stretching out behind me. To this day, I have no idea what I saw that night. Some kind of undiscovered primate, an escaped research animal, a person in a very convincing costume. Whatever it was, it felt dangerous, predatory, like it wanted to hurt me. I've tried to rationalize it over the years, tell myself it was just my imagination running wild in the dark. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Sometimes I still have nightmares about those glowing eyes and that bone-chilling growl. I've never told anyone this story before now. Who would believe me? But I swear on everything I hold dear that this is the absolute truth of what happened to me that night in the Alabama woods. I don't know if it was what some people call Bigfoot, but I do know it was unlike any animal I've ever seen before or since. The image of that creature is seared into my memory. The matted dark fur covering its massive frame, the long, powerful arms ending in curved claws, the strangely human-like face with a sloped forehead and pronounced brow ridge, and those eyes, pale yellowish green and glowing in the beam of my flashlight, filled with an alien intelligence. What haunts me the most, though, is the way it moved. There was something unnatural about its gait as it emerged from behind that tree, almost like a person in a costume, but far too fluid and graceful for that. It moved with purpose, deliberately placing one huge foot in front of the other as it approached me. And that branch it was holding, was it planning to use it as a weapon? The thought makes me shudder even now. In that moment, as I stood there paralyzed with fear, I was certain I was about to die, that this hulking beast was going to bash my skull in with that crude club. I keep replaying those terrifying seconds over and over, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't managed to break free of my paralysis and run. Would it have attacked me, dragged me off into the woods, never to be seen again? Or was it merely curious about this strange human who had wandered into its territory? I'll never know for sure. But in the 25 years since that night, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot and other cryptid sightings, and I've found dozens of accounts from all over the country that are eerily similar to my experience. Always in remote wooded areas, always a massive fur-covered humanoid creature, often holding a stick or branch. It makes me wonder just how many of these things might be out there, lurking in the wilderness. How many other people have had encounters like mine, but were too afraid of ridicule to ever speak up about it? Are they some kind of undiscovered great ape, an ancient hominid species that somehow survived to the present day, or something else entirely? I don't have any answers. but I know with absolute certainty that what I saw that night was real. It wasn't a bear or any other known animal. It wasn't a person in a suit. It was something other, something that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. But it does, and that knowledge has forever changed how I view the world and our place in it. For years afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. I would jolt awake in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I had heard that bone-chilling growl again. I became hyper-vigilant, always scanning my surroundings for any sign of danger. Even now, I can't bring myself to go camping or hiking in densely forested areas. The thought of possibly encountering that creature again is just too terrifying. I've tried to find some kind of explanation or closure over the years. I've pored over scientific journals, hoping to find some newly discovered species that might account for what I saw. I've reached out to cryptozoologists and Bigfoot researchers, but most of them just seem interested in selling books or getting on TV shows. None of them have been able to offer any real answers. There are times I've questioned my own sanity. Could I have imagined the whole thing? Was it just an especially vivid nightmare that my mind has confused with reality? But then I remember the rank smell of its fur, the way the ground shook with each of its footsteps as it approached me, the primal fear that gripped me in that moment. Those aren't the kind of details you can just imagine. I've thought about going back to that stretch of road in Alabama. Maybe if I saw it in the light of day, I could make sense of what happened. But honestly, I'm too scared. What if it's still out there, roaming those woods? What if it remembers me? I don't think I could handle coming face to face with it again. So instead, I'm left with this gnawing uncertainty, this knowledge that there are things in this world that defy explanation, that lurk just beyond the edge of civilization, rarely glimpsed, but very much real. It's changed my whole world view, made me question everything I thought I knew about nature and reality itself. I don't expect anyone reading this to believe me. I know how crazy it sounds. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. But I feel compelled to share my story, in the hopes that maybe someone else out there has experienced something similar, that I'm not alone in carrying this burden of an impossible truth. To anyone who might be reading this, if you're ever driving down a lonely road late at night and you feel the urge to pull over and step into the darkness beyond the pavement, don't. You never know what might be waiting out there in the shadows, watching and waiting. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 23. The drive started out uneventful. I dozed off for a while as we cruised down I-10, lulled by the hum of tires on asphalt and the faint country music on the radio. I woke up somewhere in Alabama as we crossed a long bridge over murky water. The dashboard clock read 2:17 a.m. "Where are we?" I mumbled groggily. "Just past Mobile," Mom replied. "Go back to sleep, sweetie. We've still got a ways to go." I tried, but something kept me awake. Maybe it was the full moon casting an eerie glow over the swampy landscape, or the way the shadows of trees seemed to reach for us as we drove by. An unsettling feeling crept over me. As we came off the bridge, Mom suddenly gasped and hit the brakes. The car lurched, and I was jolted fully awake. "What is it?" I asked, my heart racing. Mom didn't answer at first. She was staring intently at something on the road ahead, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. There, in the middle of our lane about 50 feet ahead, was something. At first glance, I thought it was a really big dog, but as my eyes adjusted to the glare of our headlights, I realized it was no dog. The creature was sitting on its haunches, perfectly still. It was huge, easily 6 feet tall even in its crouched position. Its body was covered in shaggy reddish-brown fur, but its face, God, its face. It was disturbingly human-like, with deep-set eyes that reflected our headlights like a cat's. We sat there frozen for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. The thing didn't move a muscle. It just stared at us with those glowing eyes. "Mom," I whispered, "what is that?" She shook her head slightly, not taking her eyes off the creature. "I don't know, baby," she murmured. Her voice trembled. Suddenly, Mom gunned the engine. The tires squealed as we accelerated straight at the thing. I yelped and covered my eyes, certain we were about to hit it. But we didn't. At the last second, Mom swerved around it. As we flew past, I caught a glimpse of its face turning to follow our movement. Those eyes locked onto mine for a split second, and I'll never forget the intelligence, the awareness I saw in them. This was no animal. Whatever it was thinking, reasoning. Mom didn't slow down for miles. We both sat in tense silence, too scared to speak. Finally, when we were well into Mississippi, she pulled over at a rest stop. Her hands were shaking as she lit a cigarette. "Did you see that thing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to find words. "What do you think it was?" I hesitated. "Bigfoot," I suggested weakly. Mom laughed, but it was a shaky, nervous sound. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe we're both going crazy." We sat there for a while, trying to process what we'd seen. Part of me wanted to convince myself it had been a bear or some other normal animal. But I knew deep down that wasn't true. What we saw defied explanation. Eventually, we got back on the road. But we were both on edge for the rest of the trip, jumping at every shadow. I kept expecting to see that creature again, crouched on the roadside, watching us with those terrifyingly aware eyes. We made it to Louisiana without further incident, but that night changed something in both of us. We talked about it a few times over the years, each time reassuring ourselves that there must be a logical explanation. But we both knew the truth. We'd seen something that shouldn't exist. I'm 38 now, with kids of my own. I've driven that stretch of I-10 many times since then. Every time, I find myself scanning the roadside, half expecting to see that creature again. I never have, thank God. But the memory of that night has never faded. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I can't sleep, I still see those eyes in my mind. Intelligent, aware, and utterly inhuman. I wonder if it's still out there, crouching in the shadows, watching and waiting. And I wonder how many other people have seen it and stayed silent, afraid of being called crazy. I don't know what we saw that night. Bigfoot, some unknown species, or something else entirely. I can't say for sure. But I know it was real, and I know that ever since that night, I've never felt quite as safe in the dark. The experience shook my understanding of the world. Before that night, I was a typical kid who thought I knew how things worked. Monsters weren't real, they were just stories. But after seeing that creature, I realized how little we truly know about the world around us. For weeks after the incident, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, so human, yet so alien. I'd jolt awake in a cold sweat, certain I could hear heavy breathing outside my window. Mom wasn't much better off. I'd often find her sitting at the kitchen table in the middle of the night, chain-smoking and staring into space. We tried to research what we might have seen. This was before the internet was widely available, so we spent hours at the library, poring over books about cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. Nothing quite matched what we'd encountered, though some Bigfoot descriptions came close. I became obsessed with the idea of proving what we saw was real. I started carrying a disposable camera everywhere, just in case. I'd beg Mom to take me camping, hoping we'd spot the creature again. She always refused, too scared of what we might find. As the years passed, the intensity of the memory faded somewhat, but it never truly left me. I went to college, got a job, started a family. But that night in Alabama was always there in the back of my mind, influencing me in ways I didn't always recognize. I became an avid hiker and camper, spending as much time as I could in the wilderness. Part of it was a genuine love for nature, but I can't deny that a part of me was always hoping for another encounter. I wanted confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that what we saw was real. I never told my wife or kids about that night. How could I? It sounded insane even to me, and I'd lived it. But sometimes, when we're out in the woods and the kids get spooked by strange sounds in the night, I have to bite my tongue to keep from saying, "You have no idea what's really out there." A few years ago, I stumbled across an online forum for people who've had unexplained encounters. Reading through the posts, I was struck by how many stories sounded similar to mine. People describing creatures that seemed to straddle the line between human and animal, often seen late at night on lonely roads. I was tempted to share my story, to finally open up about what happened. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear of not being believed, or maybe it was a desire to keep that night as something just between me and Mom. Mom passed away last year. On her deathbed, with her mind clouded by medication, she grabbed my hand and whispered, "Do you remember that night, with the creature?" When I nodded, she said, "It was real. I know it was real." Those were her last coherent words to me. Now, as I write this, I'm not sure why I'm finally sharing this story. Maybe it's a way of honoring Mom's memory, or maybe I'm just tired of carrying this secret alone. All I know is that what we saw that night was real, and it changed us forever. To this day, I can't drive down a dark road without scanning the shadows, half expecting to see that hulking figure crouched on the asphalt. And every time I take my kids camping, I make sure to zip the tent up tight, knowing that there are things out in the darkness that defy explanation. I don't know if I'll ever understand what we encountered that night. But I do know this: the world is stranger and more mysterious than most people realize. And sometimes, in the dark of night on a lonely stretch of road, the impossible becomes terrifyingly real. Story 24. It was July 15th, a Thursday, and my buddy Rick and I had decided to take advantage of the long summer days to do some night fishing on the Black Warrior River. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, excited to try our luck catching some big catfish under the cover of darkness. We set out in the late afternoon, Rick's old aluminum John boat loaded up with our gear. The weather was perfect, warm but not too humid, with a light breeze coming off the water. As we motored upriver, I remember feeling so at peace, watching the lush green banks slip by and breathing in that fresh river air. Little did I know the horror that awaited us. We found a good spot about 10 miles upriver, in a remote stretch surrounded by dense forest. There were a few other boats scattered around when we first arrived, mostly locals we recognized. We exchanged friendly waves as we set up our lines and settled in for what we hoped would be a productive evening. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the water, I noticed the other fishermen starting to pack up and head out. It struck me as a bit odd, since night fishing was common in these parts, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. "Looks like we'll have the whole river to ourselves soon," I remarked to Rick, as the last boat disappeared around the bend. He just grunted in response, focused on baiting his hook. Rick was always the more serious fisherman between us. Darkness fell quickly after that. Soon the only light came from our small lantern and the waning moon overhead. The sounds of the forest seemed to intensify, the drone of cicadas, the occasional splash of a fish jumping. It was peaceful, but there was also an underlying tension in the air that I couldn't quite put my finger on. We'd been fishing for a couple hours with decent luck, hauling in a few good-sized catfish when I first heard it. A strange, guttural sound echoing faintly from somewhere in the hills to our left. At first I thought it might be a bear or maybe a wildcat. but something about it sent a chill down my spine. "Hey, Rick, you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded slowly, eyes scanning the darkened shoreline. "Yeah, never heard anything quite like it before." We fell silent, straining our ears. For a few minutes all was quiet, except for the gentle lapping of water against the boat. Then it came again, louder this time and distinctly closer. It was like a cross between a roar and a scream, raw and primal in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What the hell is that?" Rick hissed, real fear evident in his voice. I shook my head, at a loss for words. In all my years hunting and fishing these woods, I'd never encountered anything that made a sound like that. Suddenly there was a loud crashing through the underbrush, as if something very large was barreling down the hillside towards the river, towards us. My heart began to race as I fumbled for the spotlight, my hands shaking. I managed to click it on, just as the creature burst out of the tree line about 50 yards downriver. The beam caught it for just a second before it let out another bone-chilling roar and plunged into the water. But that brief glimpse was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear. The way it moved was all wrong, loping on 2 legs like some nightmarish parody of a man. And its face, God, its face! In that split second of illumination, I saw glowing red eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth twisted into a snarl. "Holy shit!" Rick yelled, scrambling to pull up the anchor. "We gotta get out of here now!" I didn't need to be told twice. I dropped the spotlight and lunged for the outboard motor, yanking the cord with desperate strength. To my horror, it sputtered but wouldn't catch. Come on," I muttered, pulling again and again as panic rose in my throat. Behind us I could hear splashing getting closer. Rick had managed to get the anchor up and was now frantically searching for the spare gas can. "Hurry up, man, it's coming!" he shouted. With one final pull, the motor roared to life. I twisted the throttle as far as it would go, the flat-bottomed boat lurching forward and nearly throwing us both overboard. We shot downriver, the cool night air whipping past, as I steered us through the darkness by memory alone. I risked a glance back, and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was swimming after us with terrifying speed, its massive arms cleaving through the water as those hellish red eyes remained fixed on our boat. It let out another ear-splitting roar that seemed to shake the very air around us. "Faster!" Rick screamed. "It's gaining on us!" I pushed the little John boat to its limits, weaving around sandbars and fallen logs as we raced downstream. My knuckles were white on the tiller, every muscle in my body tense as I fought to keep us from capsizing. For what felt like an eternity, we fled through the night, the sound of splashing slowly fading behind us. Finally, after maybe 20 minutes of mad flight, we rounded a bend, and I saw the welcome lights of the boat ramp ahead. I throttled back as we approached, guiding us into the shallows. Rick and I practically fell out of the boat in our haste to reach solid ground. We stood there gasping for breath, legs shaky with adrenaline and fear. What the hell was that thing?" Rick panted, his face pale in the glow of the security lights. I shook my head, still struggling to process what we'd just experienced. "I don't know, man. I honestly don't know." We hurriedly loaded the boat onto the trailer, casting nervous glances back at the dark river the whole time. It wasn't until we were in Rick's truck, speeding down the highway, that I felt like I could breathe again. The ride home was mostly silent, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I kept replaying that terrible roar in my head, seeing those glowing eyes whenever I closed my own. "We can't tell anyone about this," Rick said suddenly as we neared town. "They'll think we're crazy." I nodded in agreement. Who would believe us anyway? But I knew with grim certainty that neither of us would ever forget that night on the river. In the days and weeks that followed, I scoured the internet and library for any information I could find. I came across scattered reports of similar creatures. Some called it Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but nothing that fully matched what we encountered. I also discovered that there was a long history of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena in that particular stretch of the Black Warrior River. Locals had nicknamed it the Devil's Backbone, and most avoided it after dark. If only we'd known. It's been over 20 years now since that terrifying night. Rick and I don't talk about it much, but I know it haunts him as much as it does me. I've never gone night fishing again, and these days I avoid being in the woods after sunset altogether. Sometimes I try to convince myself that it was all just a dream or some kind of shared hallucination, but then I'll catch a certain scent on the wind, wet fur and rotting vegetation, and it all comes rushing back. The roar, the glowing eyes, the primal fear. I don't know what's out there in the dark woods of Alabama, but I do know that some things are better left alone. If you find yourself on the Black Warrior River as night falls, take a word of advice from someone who learned the hard way. Get off the water and don't look back. Story 25. I was living in a small town in Rutland County, Vermont at the time. It was a quiet, rural area surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. My husband worked long hours at the lumber mill, so I spent most of my days alone at home, taking care of our little farmhouse and tending to my garden. That particular day started like any other. It was an unseasonably warm March morning, and I decided to open the windows to let in some fresh air while I did my usual cleaning. As I was dusting the living room shelves, something caught my eye outside the large bay window that overlooked our backyard and the forest beyond. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe a bear in the distance. But as I moved closer to the window for a better look, I realized it was something I'd never seen before. Standing at the edge of the tree line, about 100 yards from our house, was a massive, hair-covered creature. My heart started racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The thing was enormous, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark, matted fur from head to toe. But what struck me most was its posture. It wasn't on all fours like a bear. It was standing upright, on 2 legs like a person. But this was no person. Its shoulders were hunched forward, and its arms hung down abnormally long, nearly reaching its knees. The head sat directly on its shoulders, with hardly any visible neck. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but I could tell it was staring straight ahead, as if surveying the landscape. I stood frozen by the window, afraid to move or make a sound. I didn't want to draw its attention. A million thoughts raced through my mind. Was this some kind of escaped zoo animal? A person in a costume? But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those things. This creature looked too real, too natural in its environment. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the creature remained motionless, just staring into the distance. I found myself holding my breath, mesmerized by its presence. Then, without warning, it turned its head and looked directly at our house. I gasped and instinctively ducked down below the windowsill. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I stayed there, crouched on the floor for several minutes, too terrified to look up. When I finally gathered the courage to peek over the windowsill, the creature was gone. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, constantly checking out the windows and jumping at every little sound. When my husband got home that evening, I tried to tell him what I'd seen, but the words caught in my throat. How could I describe something so unbelievable? I was afraid he'd think I was losing my mind. In the days and weeks that followed, I scoured the local newspapers for any reports of strange sightings, but found nothing. I even anonymously called the sheriff's office to ask if there had been any unusual animal reports, but they just laughed it off. As time passed, I started to doubt myself. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my imagination running wild from too many lonely days at home. But every time I looked out that window, I'd get a chill down my spine, remembering the creature's massive form and those long, dangling arms. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw that day. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and watched countless documentaries, always hoping to find an explanation that would put my mind at ease. But nothing quite matches what I witnessed. The thing that haunts me most is the intelligence I sensed in that creature. The way it stood there, surveying its surroundings, it didn't seem like a mindless animal. There was a purpose to its presence, a consciousness that I can't explain. I've never seen anything like it again, despite spending countless hours staring out that same window over the years. Sometimes I wonder if it was a once-in-a-lifetime encounter with something beyond our understanding. Other times, I convince myself it was just a vivid daydream. But in my heart, I know what I saw was real. That creature, whatever it was, existed in our woods that day. And who knows, maybe it's still out there, watching and waiting, just beyond the tree line. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. Heck, there are days I have a hard time believing it myself. But I know what I saw, and I'll carry that memory with me for the rest of my life. That brief encounter changed the way I look at the world and made me realize there are things out there we may never fully understand. To this day, whenever I'm in the woods or driving down a lonely country road, I can't help but scan the tree line, half expecting to see that hulking figure again. I've never told my children or grandchildren about what I saw. How could I explain something I don't understand myself? But as I've gotten older, I've felt an increasing need to share my experience. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar. Maybe my story will give them the courage to speak up too. Or maybe it'll just be dismissed as the ramblings of an old woman with an overactive imagination. Whatever the case, I know what I saw that day in March 1977, and no amount of time or skepticism will ever erase that memory from my mind. That creature, whatever it was real. And for a brief moment, our worlds intersected in a way I never could have imagined. I often wonder what would have happened if I'd had a camera that day. Would a photo have validated my experience, or would it have just raised more questions? In a way, I'm almost glad I don't have any tangible evidence. It allows me to keep the memory pure, untainted by scrutiny or disbelief. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the moon casts long shadows across the yard, I find myself drawn to that same window. I stand there, peering into the darkness, half hoping and half fearing that I'll catch another glimpse of that mysterious creature. But it never appears. The woods remain still and silent, keeping their secrets hidden in the shadows. And I'm left with nothing but my memories and the lingering question that has haunted me for over 4 decades. What exactly did I see that day, and why was I chosen to witness it? I may never have the answers, but I know what I saw. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the day I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably does.